So we're going to get started, and hopefully you'll go away with a plethora of information about aquaculture and our opportunities that face the U.S. today. We had Congressman Colin Peterson up, but I don't think he's made it, so we're going to keep going, and I'd like to introduce Kevin Wheeler, who is our Deputy Chief of Staff for NOAA. Kevin is Deputy Chief of Staff for the Undersecretary. He's developed a lot of policy positions on behalf of the NOAA administration. He spent more than 20 years working in environmental science and policy positions in Washington. He was also served as the Executive Director for the Seafood Harvesters of America, the Vice President of the Consortium of Ocean Leadership, and the Director of Federal Relations for Brown University, which, go Providence, Rhode Island, hometown, okay? We're pretty informal in the aquaculture industry, so please stop any of us with questions, and hopefully it'll be a great day for you all. Kevin's also worked on the Science Committee for the U.S. House of Representatives and as the Special Assistant to the Director of National Institute for Environmental Health and Sciences. He's worked diligently in Capitol Hill as Press Secretary and Legislative Assistant to Congressman Sherwood B. Holt. Did I say that right?
Nope.
Okay. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Okay. He has an advanced degree for environmental management and public administration from Duke and Binghamton University. I'd like to welcome Mr. Kevin Wheeler.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here today. It's obviously a big day for aquaculture here on Capitol Hill. I think most of us are across the street watching the Senate Commerce Committee hearing on the same subject. But I'll let you know it's not just here on Capitol Hill that the federal government's engaging on aquaculture, certainly. And it's not just the Department of Commerce or NOAA, but I've been engaged with White House offices, everything from OSTP to OMB to CEQ to National Policy Committee to the National Economic Committee. Everyone's been very engaged on trying to figure out the best way forward to help grow this industry. But despite its potential, the development of aquaculture in the U.S. has been inhibited by many scientific, economic, legal, and production factors, such as inadequate credit, diffuse legal jurisdictions, and lack of management information, and a lack of supportive government policies. That's a quote from the 1980 Aquaculture Act, which I read last night after I put my kids to bed. Compelling reading, I recommend it to everybody. It's actually only 10 pages long, which is nice. So the good news is it's short. The bad news is we're far from, I think, achieving the goals of that act from 40 years ago. I mean, something else within that act I thought was interesting was it said, and I quote, although aquaculture currently contributes approximately 13% of world seafood production, less than 6% of current U.S. seafood production results from aquaculture. Now, those numbers are obviously shifted dramatically in the last 40 years. So we're approaching, I think, about 50% of global seafood production is from aquaculture, but in the U.S., still a very small percentage, I think it's maybe 10%. And obviously most of that, if not all of it, quite frankly, is in state waters or state lands. So, what else has happened since 1980? Well, the global population has dramatically increased from 4.5 to 7.7 billion people. And it's continuing to grow, obviously, so there's a demand for protein. And so while aquaculture is proliferated overseas, we now have the benefits of learning the lessons. 40 years, 4 decades of R&D and technology and advances in genetics and broodstock development. So we can do it far more sustainably in an environmentally friendly way than we did 40 years ago. Also, since the last 40 years, in the 1980s, the United States basically established our exclusive economic zone throughout our foreign fishing fleets and established a domestic commercial fishing industry. And we now lead the world in the gold standard sustainable wild capture fisheries. We've rebuilt upwards of 50 fish stocks. We've fundamentally pretty much ended overfishing commercially in our country. And yet, we haven't set the gold standard for aquaculture, at least in federal waters. So, it's a bit mind-boggling to consider the fact that the United States has arguably the largest EEZ in the world. We actually own more land that's submerged than above the water. And yet we rank something like 17th in the world in aquaculture production. So we're obviously missing something. mean, so to date, basically our aquaculture policy in federal waters has been to export science, export technology, export rootstock, and re-import seafood. That's a terrible economic model and one that's led to our $16 billion trade deficit. So how do we turn this around? I think we need to do 4 things. First, we need to combat the false narrative that we're attempting to litter the ocean with industrial fish farms that will crash fish stocks and kill dolphins and pollute the environment. We will adhere to NEPA, the Clean Water Act, Magnuson-Stevens Act, Endangered Species Act, and the Environmental Protection Act. These loss detection requirements aren't going away, nor should they. Secondly, we need to assist in the identification of ocean areas, sustainable and that could work for aquaculture in federal waters, that minimize conflicts with other ocean uses and meets our statutory obligations that I just mentioned. And we're doing this now in Hawaii, the Pacific Island region. They're doing a programmatic environmental impact assessment to find areas that are suitable for offshore aquaculture, identify what species would be good, as well as what gear types would work. Third, we need to establish a clear and predictable regulatory regime in federal waters with security of tenure that will attract investment. The clearest path of this is through new legislation, which they're discussing today across the Hill. But certainly we're also looking at executive actions to help facilitate this. And we need to bear in mind that currently there are no regulations in terms of what you can raise, where you can raise it, or how you can raise it in federal waters. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we need to elevate the global standards for aquaculture so we can have a level playing field for our domestic industry while also protecting ocean and coastal resources across the world. I mean, ultimately, our national food, environmental, and economic security requires a robust and profitable seafood industry, both wild capture as well as farms, whether it be on land, near shore, or offshore. And we need the American public to understand and have faith in the fact that U.S. seafood, all U.S. seafood, is sustainable, healthy, safe, and delicious. And they shouldn't have to have an app on their phone or a card in their wallet to know that U.S. seafood is the best in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very poignant and to the point. I really want to hug you later because that's what we try to do at USAS, which is an educational group. A lot of academia, a lot of students, and a lot of industry membership to try and get that positive word out there, and I appreciate that very much. Our next speaker comes from USDA, Dr. Silverstein, the Deputy Administrator for Animal Production and Protection with the National Program Leaders since 2016. He has a great team of leaders that directs the programs and priorities of the animal production, animal health, and veterinary medicine for USDA ARS. Jeff, Dr. Silverstein.
Thanks. Great to be with you, and indeed it's a great day for aquaculture. I'm here on behalf of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I want to bring greetings from Secretary Sonny Perdue and also from the Research, Economics, and Education Deputy Undersecretary Scott Hutchins and my administrator, Dr. Shavonda Jacobs-Young. She's the Administrator for Agricultural Research Service and the Chief Scientist for USDA. This is really a great event. It's great to see cooperation among these groups, US Aquaculture Society, Catfish Farmers of America, and the National Aquaculture Association, all committed to improving and talking about the efficiency, quality, sustainability, and the high value of US aquaculture. At USDA, we certainly view aquaculture as agriculture. We recognize that science-based expansion of domestic aquaculture is critical for meeting the nutritional needs of a growing global population. Certainly the U.S. has an abundance of aquatic natural resources and areas, Mr. Wheeler mentioned, and we see that expansion of aquaculture, including taking advantage of our diverse germplasm, marine and freshwater resources, and capacity to supply important fish feed ingredients. The United States has a rich heritage as an excellent agricultural producing nation. We have a commitment to research, development, support and implementation of innovative technologies that make sustainable production of healthful products essential. Our secretary sums up the USDA's vision as do right and feed everyone. Aquaculture fits well within the USDA's strategic plan. Goal 2 is to maximize the ability of American agricultural producers to prosper by feeding and clothing the world. The National Aquaculture Development Plan that was elaborated in the 1980 National Aquaculture Act called for specific elements to which USDA agencies continue to contribute expertise, infrastructure, and other assets. Today, USDA has 6 different mission areas and 11 agencies supporting aquaculture. I'll just touch on a couple of those. We have the Agricultural Marketing Service that fosters domestic and international markets for U.S. producers. The Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service that protects and promotes U.S. aquaculture, agriculture and aquaculture health, and they administer the Commercial Aquaculture Health Program Standards Program. In the Research, Education, Economics mission area, we have ARS, that's my home agency, where we conduct intramural research to improve domestic aquaculture production through animal health, nutrition, genetics, and water quality, product quality studies. The National Institutes of Food and Agriculture, an extramural agency focused on research, education, and extension. The Economic Research Service, conducting high-quality, objective economic research to inform and enhance public and private decision-making. The National Ag Statistics Service, which conducts the census of agriculture and the census of aquaculture. And importantly, the Foreign Ag Service that enhances export opportunities and global food security. And a couple of mission areas that I'm just learning more about, rural development, which importantly has the mission to improve the economy and quality of life in rural America through loans, grants, and loan guarantees to help create jobs and support economic development. And our farm production and conservation mission area with a risk management agency that has insurance policies to help aquaculture producers manage risk. And our Natural Resources Conservation Service, which has a variety of technical and financial programs to support aquaculture activities. So these are all important efforts supported by USDA at the department level and at the mission area level. We really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this event. We're proud that 2 of our speakers today, Craig Tucker and Care Drexrode, are USDA employees, and we really support these efforts. We also recognize the great work of all the folks in this room and all of our speakers today, and we appreciate the sustained efforts over decades of all the folks here today. Looking forward to a great conference. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. It is great to see such collaborative efforts when you talk about aquaculture. I was just speaking to some students about how aquaculture, unlike a lot of other industries, really wants to move forward. There's not that competition. Farmers want to help farmers and come together. So a rising tide rises all ships. So it's really good to see that the government is finally really going to take a stand and support that. Without any further ado, I want to introduce Jim Parsons. Jim, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because I just couldn't do it justice.
That's probably because there's not much to say. Well, thank you guys for the opportunity to speak to you today. I have been involved in salmonid aquaculture of various species since the mid-1970s. And we were discussing this yesterday. Of course, a lot of the staffers in this room weren't even alive in the mid-1970s. But it really was the Stone Age back then, literally, because we were talking about fish inventory systems and how we monitor our fish. We used to keep track of fish inventory by putting stones on the concrete walls of the raceways where we raise fish. So we've definitely come a long way since those days. Happy to say, thank goodness. And so what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about US aquaculture, the status of it, and what it really is, because there's often a misunderstanding about it. The National Aquaculture Association that I represent, I'm the president of NAA. It's basically a collection of producers, farmers, and their affiliates that are tasked with making sure that we have a unified national voice for aquaculture, primarily to promote its productivity, to ensure that it remains sustainable, and that we can develop further aquaculture in an environmentally sustainable way. So really the take-home message for today is that indeed aquaculture is alive and well. Could we be more alive and more well? Yes, certainly, and that's what I want to talk about. But the real message is it's very diverse. We talk about US agriculture. I think you all understand how diverse US agriculture is. Well, there's a similar, if not more, diversity in US aquaculture. There's been incredible worldwide growth over the past decade, and we've been part of that, but not to the extent probably that our US farms should be. So last take-home message will be the US farms face a number of different challenges than some of our worldwide partners, and we'll just touch on that, and I think you'll become more aware of that through today's talks from other speakers. If you look at the total national production, and this comes from another USDA service, this is the National Ag Statistics Service, and they do an aquaculture survey, and then as part of their farm ag service statistics, they also look again every year and every 10 years on the aquaculture specifically. What you can see here is nearly every state has aquaculture production of some aquaculture species. Ranges from the highs in some states of over $200 million worth of sales value of whatever they're producing, to many states that are in the $50 to $200 million range. Bottom line, total production based on 2017 statistics, aquaculture products sales, that's farm gate sales, not further processed sales, but farm gate sales are about $1.7 billion. So it's a fairly decently sized production number. What are those species? Well, if you look, there are a variety of species that are raised, as we mentioned. Throughout the United States, live bait is sold for fishing. Much of the bait fish that are used in the United States come from farms that provide a safer alternative than capturing fish from the wild and distributing them throughout the United States without consideration of what pathogen risk there might be. There are approximately $50 million worth of sales of live bait fish in the United States. Next, if we look at ornamental fish, both freshwater and marine, it continues to grow to successfully compete with imports from foreign countries that are often captured from their wild environment and brought into the United States. If in the case of marine ornamentals, like Nemo and his friends here, aquaculture provides a much more sustainable method than capturing these fish off of the reefs, the coral reefs, that has been done for years. We have a large research community and industry community that's working on production of these species. Many times it's very complex life cycles that they have to work out in order to breed these in captivity. Total value in 2017 is estimated at roughly $66 million. Production of crustaceans, in this case, it's crawfish, typically in the southern states, but also a very large growing industry in marine shrimp, often not even in marine waters. This was valued in a decade ago at roughly $50 million. In 2017, that's grown to $100 million worth of production of crustaceans in this country. Trout, one that's near and dear to my heart, has remained a hugely popular aquaculture species in the United States. Many of our farms produce trout for recreational stocking purposes throughout the country, and that's remained a large part of what we do, but it's also production of trout for food. If you look at the total production of rainbow trout alone as a food item throughout the world, there's almost 2 billion pounds of rainbow trout that are produced for food worldwide. We're nowhere near that level in this country, but our estimated sales value is roughly $240 million of trout that are sold in the United States. Mollusks are a very large segment for US aquaculture. That includes oysters, mussels, and clams from many of our coastal states. If you've been to an oyster bar recently, you know that there are far more varieties out there than the 3 species that are commonly raised in the United States. And each one, we coined a new word. Instead of terroir for wines, we have meroir for the various rearing areas of oysters. So that has really blossomed, and this particular industry has really taken off. Estimated value for mollusk culture in the United States is $350 million. And then our friend the catfish, as the Catfish Institute likes to say, catfish is king. And it was one of the largest sectors for US aquaculture. That decreased somewhat in recent years due to competition from catfish-like species that were coming in from Southeast Asia, but is now on the rise again, and total value roughly $360 million in 2017. We also have other species, and we learned quickly you don't mess with gator farmers, okay? These guys are tough. You have to be tough to be a gator farmer. But beyond just gators, there are, we could populate the entire screen with all the different species. But a growing area is marine algae. Seaweed farming is really picking up interest, even in states like Alaska that pledged never to do aquaculture, even though they have the largest aquaculture program in the US based on the species that they release, but we won't discuss that. Other food fish items, tilapia, hybrid striped bass, are very large, and we also have species that are used to control pests in the case of mosquito fish or triploid grass carp, sterile grass carp, that are raised and used for aquatic weed control throughout the United States. Total value of other species is roughly $160 million. It's important to understand that a lot of this production, so this $1.8, $1.7 billion worth of aquaculture production, comes from small farms. Roughly, the vast majority of these farms are even family owned and have been passed down through the generations and remain family farms. So there are trout farms and oyster farms that have been in business and supplying customers for well over 100 years. And the Ag Statistics Service estimated that roughly 40% of the farms provide products with sales of less than $25,000. So when you think about a total of $1.7 billion, that's a lot of farms. I'm going to use an example here just to show some of the some of what we're up against in aquaculture as an example of what the U.S. faces. And this is something that I've chosen simply because I'm most familiar with it. I'm currently the general manager for a company in Washington State that previously produced Atlantic salmon and now is producing other local species in a marine environment. If you look at marine salmonid production, so trout and salmon species that were produced in marine waters in 2016 worldwide, there were 2.6 billion kilos, or roughly 5.86 billion pounds of salmonids produced in marine waters worldwide in 2016. That value brought 16.6 billion US dollars farm gate sales. Where did that come from? Well, if you look at the distribution of the farming, Norway is far and away the largest producer. And back in the mid-1980s, the Norwegian government decided that they needed a method to keep rural areas along the coasts productive and keeping people on those coasts to prevent them from moving into the big towns. And salmon farming became one of the ways that that was done. Currently, they produce 1.3 billion kilos of Atlantic salmon, valued at roughly $8 billion to the Norwegian economy. Chile comes in second at roughly half of that. Where does all that go? If you look at Atlantic salmon imports into the United States, you see that in 2017, there was 660 million pounds of Atlantic salmon products. So now we're not talking about the round weight fish, we're talking about the finished products that are coming into the United States, valued at $3 billion of imports that came into the US. In 2018, that is expected to be a little closer to $4 billion of Atlantic salmon product that's imported into the United States from around the world. When you think about a seafood deficit of $16 billion, you can tell where one of the large segments actually is. And if we were talking about building a wall, I know where I'd build it, but that's beside the point. So, what are the challenges to US aquaculture that are preventing similar growth in the United States? They're varied and many, and you're going to hear a lot about those in the rest of the talks today. I'm just going to touch on one to give you an idea of what we're up against. There's been a lot of research done by Carl Engel and Jonathan Van Senten on the cost of regulations to American aquaculture farms. And if you look at this, particularly as a percentage of total cost, this is the regulatory cost and constraint to our industry. Salmonid farms, roughly 12% of the total cost go to regulatory issues. Bait fish, sport fish, 25%, and our shellfish farms, molluscan producers, almost 30% of their total cost is to meet regulation. Of those regulations, a large majority of it is based on environmental regulation, meeting the constraints to make sure that the environment around our farms and as a result of our farming practices remains sustainable and clean. So when we hear that the United States needs to consider higher environmental standards for its aquaculture production, we tend to say, look at what we already do. From the rest of today's speakers, you're going to hear more about the sustainability of US aquaculture. You're going to hopefully understand that US aquaculture can be an engine for further economic activity and growth. US aquaculture provides us a way to reduce the trade deficit and improve our country's health. If you look at a study that was done by Harvard Medical that looked at the causes of premature death in the United States, it's estimated that there are 84,000 deaths per year that could be prevented by increased consumption of seafood. With 90% of our seafood coming in from foreign sources, and half of that being aquaculture product, we have a huge opportunity to increase the production in our own country and improve our population's health. And lastly, we believe that US Aquaculture provides a way to improve our food security in the United States. We have a large amount of land and water in the United States, both along our coasts and in our freshwater systems. We believe firmly that if we utilize these in a sustainable manner with environmental regulations we already have and with increased assistance through various methodologies and agencies, we can also provide a large portion of the seafood that we consume in the United States. If you'd like more information on what the NAA does or some of our members and what they do, and with links to a lot of these other agencies, you can visit us at the NAA website, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this point.
Good morning. I'm Jimmy Avery. I'm an extension aquaculture specialist with Mississippi State University. I have been extension specialist in 2 different states, and that's represented a kind of an experience of somewhere between 6 or 8 different species throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. So I've had 37 years working with farmers, everything from turtles and alligators to catfish, baitfish, a lot of different species in those 2 states. One thing that's been consistent when you look at those farmers across the years and across the states is that, as Jim pointed out, they're all small family farms, at least the ones that I've been working with. They have an extreme economic impact in the areas in which these farms occur. You look at the Mississippi Delta, you look at southeastern Louisiana, they are economic drivers within those counties or parishes. And they're also, since all these are family farms, and typically they're 3rd or 4th generation farms in most cases, they have learned to be good stewards of that land that they have been entrusted with. And so it's very forefront in their plans to make sure that that land continues to be available to that next generation. So to get their point across, it was the organizing committee's thought process to give you essentially 5 different looks at small family farms across the U.S. The first one we're going to start off with will be the catfish. Thank you.
I'm Chris McGlon, a catfish farmer in Morgan City, Mississippi. I have 2 kids. Reese is my son, he'll be 11. Anna Rivers is my daughter, she'll be 10 this year, and my wife is Missy. This industry is great for a family. From my wife to my kids, I mean, we're all involved. We don't have any employees. You know, we do everything here ourselves. You know, my wife feeds, I maintain, check oxygen. Here on our farm, you know, we really stress our water quality and make sure that our water is filtered naturally through a raceway system. We have a 26-inch auger that pumps about 10,000 gallons per minute. You know, we have a wastewater cell that's normally about 80% of the pond. And then we have a holding area that holds this 20% that actually holds the fish. And we're naturally just circulating water, you know, this actually filtering the water in the pond naturally.
We're currently in Fonsdale, Alabama, very small rural area, a lot of farming activities in this area, and particularly catfish. The more efficient an animal is in converting grain or feed products into protein, the better it is for the environment, the better it is for all of us. It's less land taken up by farming that could be used for other things. For instance, catfish, mainly corn, soybean meal, and at a 2-to-1 feed conversion, you know, that's far better than almost anything else you can name. I can't think of another product that has a feed conversion that we do, turning grain into meat as efficiently as catfish does. All that's a sense of pride that I see when I see somebody eating catfish. You know, obviously we hope it comes from our farms because we know that it is the best product there is. My name is John. My family and me are catfish farmers in West Alabama.
My name's Carl Engel, president of Herring Catfish, and we're located in Wisner, Louisiana. Well, we employ about 175 people in the whole operation. There's about 130 in the processing plant. And then we have our own trucking company, which have about a dozen truck drivers, and have a feed mill. We manufacture our own feed. And so it has a pretty good impact because all the goods that we buy, we try to buy as locally as we can from Northeast Louisiana. Our boxes, all our supplies, our bags, everything we can. So it has an impact. Of course, the salaries we have has an impact on the town. It's keeping the little town going, I think, and it keeps a lot of people employed and keeps some children at home instead of trying to leave. Farm-raised catfish is special because it's safer. You know, it's raised in a controlled environment and it's sustainable. You know, we know what the diet is. They fed a high-protein diet, feed. All the fish that come here that we bring in are live, so they're live when they're processed. So I think it's just sustainable and a safer product.
Really, there's not a day that goes by that I don't feel good about what I do. My name is George Smelly. We're in Greensboro, Alabama. I'm a catfish and cattle farmer. I think catfish is as safe a product as could possibly be. We've had FDA, we've had HACCP, we've had, of course, our state and local inspections for years, but USDA provided us with a stamp of approval that Americans have become familiar with and feel comfortable with other commodities like beef and pork and chicken, and why not catfish? It's raised and processed here.
And I think for the consumers, it's peace of mind. It's for the mothers grocery shopping. It's just a good peace of mind that they're USDA inspected, and we're doing a wonderful job keeping it good and clean.
With that, we have Dr. Engel, who's done the not so fun, in my mind, economic analysis, a lot of that stuff, but she's been awesome in that industry and several others in helping figure out where they can cut costs and make more money. I think the only thing that's has a better feed conversion ratio is bugs, and the U.S. is not ready to eat bugs yet, so we got to keep going with aquaculture. Dr. Engel.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I am an economist. My name is Carl Engel, as Angie said, and I'm an economist who fell in love with aquaculture more than 40 years ago now and just never lost my fascination with it. I don't see economics as a dismal science. I see it as the engine that drives our economy, that pays our salaries, that helps us to have the quality of life and standard of living that we enjoy here in the United States. And of course, when you study marketing and other things, there are other advantages that we get to eat all these wonderful products. I think one of the best things in my career has been the opportunity and the real pleasure I've had of getting to know and work with aquaculture producers all across the United States and really understand these businesses that are so different from each other. You got a glimpse of that from Jim's talk earlier today of how different these different businesses are, how different the business models are, the entrepreneurial spirit, and the people who really made these industries work. It's been a real pleasure for me to do that and learn these things over the years. So I'm going to share with you briefly just some of these opportunities and some of the ways that aquaculture contributes to economies. If anybody wants specific details or copies of the studies that I'm sort of alluding to or drawing information from, please let me know and be happy to share those with you. Well, the first thing, of course, to understand is we are one of the largest seafood markets in the world. Per capita, we may not eat all that much, but we are. And so we are eating about 5 billion pounds of seafood a year in the United States. We're second only to China in terms of seafood consumption. So this is a big market for aquaculture and for seafood generally right here in the United States. But as you've heard before, we're importing over 90% of all the seafood that we eat in the United States. And that means two things. That means those dollars of revenue are all going to the countries that we import from. But there's a second thing that's not as obvious. that means the production is happening in those other countries as well, and all the economic contributions from the production side are also occurring elsewhere and not in the United States. The irony of this, from my perspective, is that we do it right in the United States. We really do. We hold ourselves at very high standards in terms of environmental responsibility, in terms of ethics, in terms of social responsibility. We do this as citizens of this country, but we also do it in terms of a regulatory environment and laws that were passed to protect this and enforce it. And so we do it right in the United States. More than this, the other thing that's really expanded recently is that consumers in the U.S. increasingly are asking for locally produced food. Some of this is coming from an interest in food miles of the food that they're eating, but some of this also comes from the idea that farms are part, and farmers are people that are part of our communities, and supporting the local community is something that's worthwhile. So we have sort of this conundrum of what's going on. We do it right, we know how to do it right, we want locally produced food, but when it comes to seafood, we're importing 90% of what we eat. We raise in the United States, as Jim pointed out, all of these very delicious kinds of foods, from trout and salmon and catfish to shrimp and oysters and all these different kinds of things. I see this incredible opportunity to grow US aquaculture that will do several things for us if we can grow this and grow it more rapidly than we have. It means that our food supply will be more secure in terms of seafood. It's raised right here in the United States under the high standards that we have in the United States. And it's produced from an ethical perspective, it's produced in terms of social responsibility and according to the standards that we have in the United States. Along the way, growing US aquaculture will bring substantial economic opportunities, especially in our rural and coastal areas, which is, of course, where most aquaculture farms are located. So I'm going to talk more about what some of these contributions are and look at what these entail. Well, first of all, as has already been pointed out, there are aquaculture farms in just about every state in the United States, so it's scattered across the United States. These occur mostly in rural and coastal areas that very much need the economic contributions and support. The other thing that I think is more unusual about aquaculture than some other industries that you might be familiar with is that a lot of the supplies and inputs really are purchased locally. The grains used to feed food fish in the United States are all grown in the United States. A lot of the supplies that have developed, the equipment manufacturers, are businesses that develop specifically to supply these kinds of products to US aquaculture. These come locally, and so in terms of economic contributions, that dramatically expands what that impact in those contributions are as other businesses are stimulated. This is just, to me, has always been really fascinating. We've had research on equipment development and other things, but the reality is a lot of this is developed on farms. If you look at the catfish industry, for example, adapting nets from capture fisheries had to be done in order to be able to harvest efficiently, and the harvesting nets and boom nets. If you want to see an interesting piece of engineering, these crawfish harvesters and crawfish ponds are fascinating if you haven't seen it. But this is all equipment that's been innovated and developed on farms. If you Google oyster growing gear online, you'll come up with all sorts of companies that have developed new oyster gear products and companies that have developed it. This is all part of the economic support and contributions that US aquaculture have made. Now let's take a little bit closer look at food fish farms, for example. I'm sure you all are familiar with multipliers, and a lot of people throw a lot of numbers around about multipliers. But of course how they work is when a food fish farm purchases feed, for example, those dollars flow back to the feed mill. Those dollars in the feed mill then are used to pay for that investment. They pay for the employees. They are used to pay and purchase all the other supplies, and those dollars multiply throughout the economy. Food fish farms, the major cost that they have is the feed. The feed is composed of grains, and so these feed mills are spending money to purchase the grains from the row crop sector in the United States. A lot of soybeans, corn, wheat. Just think about if we could replace 10% of those imports with US grown product, 20%, 30%. Think what that means in terms of increased demand for US grown soybeans and the support for soybean prices and prices of corn and wheat and other important commodities to our agricultural sector. It's a very important source of contribution. Talked about the equipment as well, as dollars flowing into equipment companies, other kinds of supplies. All of these companies hire employees, and these dollars expand throughout the economy. We can't forget about the finance sector either. A lot of the major sectors of US aquaculture are financed through small rural agricultural banks. I live in a rural county myself, and I know how nice it is to walk into my bank and they know me and I know them. I've been dealing with the same people since I first went to that bank, and there's just a sense of community about these things that I think comes from having vibrant rural economies grown out of agriculture and farms. Now, so far, this is all the production sector, and this is just the production sector of food fish farms, but there's something that I don't hear discussed often enough. If you really step back and think about Economics 101, and you step back and think about what really drives economic growth, it is the production sector. It's not a service sector. You can have dollars multiplying through a service sector, and there are short-term benefits, but long-run economic growth and wealth creation comes out of production sectors. It's no secret why China's economic growth was so high. It came from the investment they made in their manufacturing sector. So we get a greater multiplier effect from production sides than we do from the marketing and distribution sides. But there is an economic contribution, clearly. So if we look at food fish farms that are selling mostly at processing plants, but they also sell direct to restaurants, supermarkets, farmers markets. So all of these include and also contribute to the economy. Processors sell to brokers and distributors, and they turn around and sell to restaurants and supermarkets. So this is all part of it. These marketing distribution sectors, though, really are service sectors. So again, if we think about imports, we talk about imports coming in, they're contributing through the service sectors, through the distribution sectors now. If we replace 20%, 30% of that supply, then we maintain that contribution because domestic supply fits into it, but we still capture the entire production side that is really a much stronger engine for economic growth and development than just the marketing side of it. Pound for pound, U.S. produced seafood will contribute far more employment, economic activity, because it contributes to so many other production sectors and is a productive activity as well. Well, I could talk about the impacts of all kinds of different sectors of U.S. aquaculture, but I'll just use one other example. Of these fish that are raised as bait fish or sport fish, they still have the production kinds of impacts on this side of purchasing feed and hiring employees. But in addition to that, they're selling to anglers. Anglers spend a lot of money on tackle and boats and lodging, and so there's this whole other kind of impact that happens from the industries in the U.S. that are supplying fish to support recreational activities in the United States that touches a lot of other sectors in the economy. So really, this sector of U.S. aquaculture is supporting tourism activities in many different states. There was a study done several years ago now that looked at the effect of stocking trout for recreational purposes in the western region. Look at this multiplier, 36 to 1. This is sort of a short-term kind of multiplier like I was talking about, but it's very, very large, because anglers spend a lot of money. It's recreation and they'll do that, and it triggers this amount of development. That particular study estimated the total contribution of trout in western states to be about $2 billion annually, just of trout in the western states. There are other studies that have sort of dug into, so which sectors are affected by this. The food fish sector, of course, is really creating demand for other agricultural products, especially grains is maybe a major sector in equipment and things like this. But this study looked at economic impacts and contributions from bait fish and sport fish. Look what's on this list, couriers and messenger services. It's not something you'd really think about, but there's at least one state in the United States where the top two customers of FedEx are fish farms. are fish farms. And you think about this and you think about how that happens. You think about, in this case, repair and maintenance of automobiles and vehicles and different kinds of equipment were very strong, and also construction of highways, streets, bridges, tunnels, and other sorts of things. So we don't often think about these other kinds of impacts, especially from sectors of US aquaculture other than the food fish sectors. A recent study in Pennsylvania showed that fish farms, some of which were food fish, but a lot of them were recreational fish, contributed to more than 500 different economic sectors just in Pennsylvania alone, not including the ones that are considered leakages outside of the state of Pennsylvania into other states. That's tremendous. And we see this across the way because we don't see how all of these expenditures from fish farms that really are, in some cases, very unique and different from other sectors, the tremendous influence that these have in throughout the economy. Now, these contributions are really quite strong, but when you really look at it, they're even stronger on the very local level, especially in states in the United States where there are strong clusters of aquaculture farms. So I'm going to just share two examples of this. Could talk any number of different examples, but I'm just going to share two with you here right now. Let's look at the state of Washington in the Northwest. The state of Washington is especially known for its shellfish industry. They produce this tremendous variety. Gooey ducks are exported, for example, but oysters is what they're very well known for, and clams and mussels and other things. But they also produce trout, and they produce some other species. If we look at the economic impact and contribution just of the shellfish industry, because that's one where we have a very good economic impact study that was done for. These farms have been there for more than 100 years in many cases, third and fourth generation shellfish farmers in Washington. These data are all dated right now too, or the study was done in 2010. But you look at these numbers and then you think about this just being shellfish. Shellfish, of course, happens only along the coast of Washington. If you've driven along that coast of Washington, you know what a lot of those towns look like. And you start to look at these numbers, 2,700 jobs strictly along the coast of the state of Washington, 77 million in labor income, total economic output of 184 million. And again, these are a decade ago old and would have to be inflated to get a realistic estimate. But these are substantial impacts. Let's look at an example in the South. The state of Mississippi is the second largest aquaculture producing state in the United States. Mississippi is well known for its catfish industry. The catfish industry is the largest sector of US aquaculture still, and Mississippi is the largest producer of catfish. But they also raise hybrid striped bass, sportfish, and some other species. Catfish farms have been around for more than half a century too. This is not a brand new industry. But when you look at these counties, and you look at the counties in the heart of the catfish industry, say Humphreys County, Mississippi, two of the top 3 employers in that county are catfish processing plants. If you look at the top 3 catfish producing counties in Mississippi, in 2018 sales, $600 million, and then 3,300 employees. If those of you who have had the opportunity to drive through these counties in Mississippi, and if you haven't, I encourage you to do so. When you do drive through those counties and just look out your windshield and look around, think about what 3,300 employees and jobs means for those counties. It means a lot in these counties. So in local areas, some of these industries absolutely drive this. I could give you many other examples of counties where the #1 economic activity is aquaculture. In this case, in Mississippi, those top 3 counties, $823 million total economic output. So why is it we're importing so much seafood into the United States? We've heard some comments about it, but why is this happening? The other part of this sort of, I don't know if it's an irony or I'm not sure what it is, but the reality is that much of what we import is being raised under conditions that we do not condone in the United States. And by creating this demand to bring product in that is not raised sustainably, that is raised in ways that has unbelievable amounts of discharge into the environment. We have one planet. These oceans touch our sides and touch our shores, both of the major oceans, with unregulated discharges. The studies continue to come out for 10, 15 years of indiscriminate use of antibiotics in raising products that we're purchasing and bringing into the United States. These studies are showing use of antibiotics that are totally banned for use in livestock feeds in the US for very good reasons. Unregulated workforce conditions, I'm sure you've read these stories as well. They just don't have the same regulatory environment that we have. And so by creating this demand for those products to come in, we're enabling conditions that we don't tolerate. There's something quite ironic about all of this. Now, Jim mentioned this study and talked about the direct regulatory costs. I'm just showing this one slide, an example of the shellfish industry, because these studies have also measured lost opportunities. Now, let me give you an example. That we have high standards in the United States. Our aquaculture farmers have high standards for themselves and what they're doing in the United States. But what we're finding with regulations is that they've become inefficient. They've become so bureaucratic that they're unnecessarily increasing costs through redundancies and duplication of regulations and things like this. And a number of studies are coming out to support this. Let me give you one example. Let's say somebody wants to get a permit to raise shellfish somewhere. They're told by the regulatory agency, you have to do these 6 different studies, whatever those are. Every story is a little bit different. But say they have to do a survey on eelgrass, and they have to do a survey on seal haul-out areas, and they have to do a whole host of water quality testing. They do all of that. They invest the money, they contract the biologists and whoever's capable of doing it. They do all of that. They get the results back. They spend a year, maybe 2, putting all of these studies together. They were told that they had to do. No problems are found. Why does it take them, that farm 5 or 10 years to get a permit? Now that's the kind of reality that happens. And I've not heard farmers complain about doing the studies and the testing. It's the delays that are really creating opportunities for other industries to ship here and preventing our industries from being as large as they could be and having the economic contributions that they could have. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations says that the U.S. is the world's most efficient food producer. They're talking about grains and other kinds of food products, but we're known for that. We have the natural resources to expand aquaculture. We have the research infrastructure. You're going to hear more about our research infrastructure for aquaculture in the United States. I think we don't give enough credit to this bullet here that we also have with multiple generations and decades of experience raising fish and shellfish among the fish farmers and shellfish farmers in the United States is a tremendous asset to our country. It's not easy to raise fish and shellfish. I know, I've killed a lot of them. And so it's not easy, and we have a tremendous knowledge in the United States to do it. And we know how to do it right, and we are doing it right in the United States. So how do we turn this around? I think we can turn it around. I think the U.S. has the potential to become a major exporter, to become more self-sufficient than ever before, but we do need a level playing field. We need to hold imported product to the same high standards of environmental responsibility and food safety that we hold our domestic producers. We also need to reduce and eliminate the inefficient parts of our regulatory system and the unnecessary regulatory costs, maintain adequate oversight to eliminate what's not necessary. But we also all need to insist, all as individual citizens of this country, that discussions are based on accurate information. I applaud the US Aquaculture Society for coming to DC and organizing this. They represent the scientific community related to aquaculture in the United States and have access to sound science. But unfortunately, there is an incredible amount of misinformation that often is due to other agendas for different groups of individuals. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. Are we holding questions until the end, Angie, or?
You've got a couple of minutes if you want to take a question or two.
Are there any questions that I could try to answer or respond to? Yes, sir.
Do you have a sense of scale between regulatory impacts or benefits of regulatory reform versus leveling the playing field? Which one would, if we solve one of those two issues, which one gets a better bang for the buck?
They affect different sectors differently, and in terms of regulatory inefficiencies, I think some sectors of U.S. aquaculture would be more important to deal with, equivalent food safety standards, and other sectors of U.S. aquaculture would be more important to deal with regulatory inefficiencies. So it depends on those particular sectors and what's happening in their markets. Aquaculture is just so diverse. It'd be very difficult for me to say one or the other, because it's different for different segments of U.S. aquaculture.
Sure. Okay. I guess I was trying to, looking at the, as you said, it's really diverse. Looking at the entire U.S. aquaculture, as well as maybe commercial angling components. If we level the playing field, is it a tenfold benefit if we across the entire sector, and if we improve regulatory reform, is it a twofold benefit across the entire sector? If we had to focus our efforts on one thing, what, can you provide guidance on what one thing we should focus our efforts on?
The studies that we've done on regulatory costs are looking at each specific sector, and these lost opportunities are really quite large. If you look at that study for shellfish, was only done on West Coast shellfish, but the lost opportunities are more than twice, and those are annual sales, more than twice the size of the current industry on the West Coast of the United States. We're just starting up a similar study on the East Coast, but I suspect we'll find something similar. The US Catfish Industry, the one that I've worked with very, very closely, would very much benefit from level playing field in terms of the issues of antibiotic use in some of their major competitors coming into the United States. They clearly could be double the size that they are right now. And that's one of the reasons for the contraction for several years before they've started to recover in the last 4 or 5 years. So they could easily be double. I'd have to go back and try to give that all some more thought, but I think we could easily have an industry just for those two reasons easily. I think it's conservative to say it could be twice the size that it is right now, easily.
Thank
and
you.
down the road, it could be even more if for other reasons. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, hi. I'm hoping you could. Hi, thank you. I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about what you refer to as misinformation, and are you talking about kind of the ratings from the Monterey Bay Aquarium and that kind of thing? Or are you talking more about environmental groups and stereotypes about aquaculture? And if you could talk a little bit about how to combat that misinformation.
There's studies that have looked at this kind of thing in other sectors of agriculture, and the message is to overcome one negative one, even if that negative story was not at all true. And so we really need to help and really need a concerted effort to get accurate information out. A lot of, there's so much of it that you see, a lot of it is on social media, you see it repeated in the press, and so you see people just picking up little snippets of things. But statements like aquaculture is unsustainable, aquaculture is destroying the environment, aquaculture is polluting. These statements are just almost nonsensical when you think about raising seaweed or raising shellfish. You think about the way catfish are raised, and Craig Tucker is going to talk more about some of these environmental kinds of things. You see just all of these statements, they're laced with antibiotics. Even with salmon is usually been the trigger for a lot of this. And quite honestly, there's been funding from some groups like sport fishing groups that are concerned about the increased volume of salmon that has led to lower prices of salmon. That means we can all enjoy more salmon at a lower price than before. They have other agendas behind them. Animal rights groups will say all sorts of things, but their agenda is to get us all to quit eating any kind of animal protein and to give up our pets and to not ride horses. And their agenda is other than that concern. But salmon and antibiotics, when you look at the actual data and numbers, antibiotic use in salmon has just plummeted, and not recently. It's over 10 years or more ago. I'd have to look at those graphs again, but they developed vaccines, and so they've gone to vaccines to prevent disease instead of instead of having to rely on antibiotics. And so these statements abound. I suggest that you contact the US Aquaculture Society to fact check things that before they're being repeated again, because there's just so much of it out there. Painting a negative image of aquaculture that is not what I see in working with producers across the United States, and it doesn't match the science that's out there at all. But it takes 10 positive messages to overcome one negative one. I think my time is up. Thank you very much. I'll be around all day if you have other questions.
My name's Patrick Hudson, and this is St. Jerome Creek in Southern Maryland, home of True Chesapeake Oyster Company. We've been growing oysters here since 2012 and steadily growing every year. We sold our first oyster in 2013, and today we have over 5 million oysters under cultivation, and we sell oysters to customers all over the country, in Chicago and Atlanta, and DC and Baltimore. So farming oysters begins on land in a nursery where we raise the seedlings, and after that they go out into cages where they spend about 2 years in the water eating the natural algae that's in the water and sort of soaking up the flavor of this part of the Chesapeake Bay. And after about 2 years, we harvest them and box them up and ship them off to the market. I think it's an exciting time to be in the aquaculture industry in Maryland. You know, it's a growing industry, but it's not without its challenges. You know, the best places to grow oysters in the Chesapeake Bay are oftentimes the most beautiful and scenic places in the Chesapeake Bay, just like St. Jerome Creek here. And that presents a challenge within the community and with different interest groups. And I think our job as oyster farmers is just to do our best to blend into the community and to provide good jobs and to provide a great high quality product that people across the country can love to enjoy and can kind of celebrate as a product of the Chesapeake Bay. I think that there are a lot of reasons to support oyster aquaculture from an economic standpoint and from an environmental standpoint. I mean, the larger the oyster aquaculture industry gets, the more beneficial the impact on the environment we're going to have. You know, we've done a really good job of choosing ways to grow oysters in such a way that you wouldn't really notice that we're even here. And that's, I think, the goal. So I think part of the challenge that we're going to face going forward as a growing industry is how to educate people on what exactly it is we're doing. Because on the one hand, you know, a commercial activity in a place like St. Jerome Creek might come as a shock to some people, but I think the reality is that you know, we're able to do what we do quietly and, you know, without any real impact, any real negative impact on the community around us, and we're able to provide good jobs and you know, bring some recognition to a great, you know, Chesapeake Bay oyster that people really love to eat all around the country.
With that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Tucker, and he can introduce himself. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Craig Tucker. I have a long history working for the university, Mississippi State University, and I work for USDA now. Most of my work over the years has been on environmental issues, but mainly inside the culture system. In other words, keeping the culture system in a very clean state so that the fish grow well. And starting in about the 1990s, I started working on outside the system. What are some of our impacts on outside the system? And I've given a number of these presentations, usually much longer than this. This is an extremely complicated subject, as I'll mention here in a minute. There are semester-long and 2-semester-long courses at universities that cover these issues, and dozens of books have been written on it. Part of the difficulty is the diversity. We normally think of agriculture as being a very diverse undertaking, and it is. There's quite a few plant species that are raised in the world that contribute to what we eat. 30 plant species make up about 95% of everything humans eat globally, but only 4 of those represent about 75% of all the consumption of the plants that we eat. Same thing with animal species. Quite a few different animals are raised for food in the world, but really only a very few make up roughly 75% of the food we eat. This is in contrast with aquaculture globally. Right now, there are over 600 species of aquatic plants and animals that are raised in aquaculture. Extraordinarily diverse. This will change over time as consolidation and food tastes and so on change. But even at that, right now, there's 35 species that we would consider dominant. In other words, there's extremely significant production of a huge number of animals. And Jim Parsons went over some of this. There are microorganisms that are raised, microalgae. These are raised for food and fuel. Spirulina is a health additive that you can buy in any drugstore. There's a lot of algae being grown for biofuels. You see advertisements on TV by Exxon say the future is going to be biofuels from algae. Seaweeds has already been mentioned a couple of times. Shellfish of many kinds, crustaceans of several kinds, and of course fish. And these fish include not only food fish has been mentioned, but Jim also mentioned bait fish and ornamental fish. So there's this extraordinarily diverse number of animals that are raised. But what really sets aquaculture apart in terms of looking at the environmental impacts of aquaculture is this amazingly diverse array of culture systems and environments in which we try to raise these animals. This is an inshore seafood or seaweed farm. Shellfish, it's already been mentioned. There's been several pictures of shellfish. Inland ponds make up most of aquaculture in the world. Raceways, to raise trout, say, and other animals where water flows in, the fish are put in it, and the water flows out. Completely indoor systems have already been mentioned too. Net pens that are placed in near-shore areas that hold the fish in relatively protected near-shore areas. And then really fantastical offshore caged fish farms that the projections are just these vast underwater farms and cages holding fish. Each and every one of these species and each and every one of these different culture systems has a different set of resource requirements and a different sort and a different array of impacts on the environment. And so going through each one of them is an impossible task, even for several books. To simplify things, I'm going to make 2 generalizations about resource use. Sort of give you a general idea of where we are with respect to resource use compared to other animals. Then I'm going to use 2 examples from our 2 largest sectors of aquaculture about environmental impacts, give you some idea where we are. Some of this has already been mentioned by both Jim and Carol. This is normally, the first generalization I'm going to make has to do with where we get the food to raise the animal or plant. What is the food source for growth? This is normally what we think of when we think of aquaculture. Resources are brought in from outside, formulated into feeds, and then fed to the fish. This is, a good term for this is just fed aquaculture. But there's this whole other aspect of it that several people, again, have mentioned already, and we generally call this extractive aquaculture. And it's called extractive because we're actually using materials from in the environment that are extracted into the animal or plant and are used for growth. This happens to be seaweed. Seaweeds grow by taking potential pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon dioxide, from out of the environment and temporarily sequestering them inside their tissue. In other words, they're removing potential pollutants into a useful, sometimes edible, but for pharmaceuticals and so forth product. So that's extracting these growth factors into a product. Shellfish is the classic example. We normally, unless you know a little bit about how shellfish eat, this might be a little bit strange to you, but what they do is they take water that has phytoplankton in it, very small particulate microorganisms. They filter it through their shell, through essentially their gills, and they extract from that phytoplankton and other plants that they use for growth. So they take in suspended matter and they excrete clean water. The Nature Conservancy put out a series of slides that show some of the advantages of shellfish aquaculture. These are really instructive. I always like using slides from environmental organizations when I talk about these things. First of all, I just mentioned this. Oysters equal clean water. They have an example of one oyster will filter 50 gallons of water a day. In other words, they're going to clean 50 gallons of water a day by taking the particulate matter out of there. Someone already mentioned, Carol, I guess it was already mentioned, or no, it was Angie, already mentioned the usefulness of shellfish aquaculture for coastal renovation. Shellfish reefs, shellfish farming helps to dissipate wave energy and therefore reduces erosions of shorelines. And of course, happy fishermen, you make money. So there's an economic benefit to it too. We've already seen a short video of this, and so and we're going to hear later a little bit more about shellfish aquaculture. So now I'm going to turn back to fed aquaculture, which is what I know most about. This is different in that the resources we use for growth are derived from outside. These are usually feed ingredients that are formulated into feed and then fed to the animal, and they're basically the same for terrestrial animals. And so there's some comparisons here to how aquacultural animals rank compared to terrestrial animals. And this is extremely important because this has implications for all sorts of resource use down the line. I'm going to use one specific example. This is all related to how efficient fish are in converting, and I think Jim mentioned this, how efficient fish are in converting food to flesh. Here's some terrestrial animals. Cattle just happen to be notorious for several reasons for being relatively inefficient, so on and so forth. Poultry are actually extraordinarily efficient. Been so much work on diets and particularly the genetics of this animal that it's, for a warm-blooded animal, it's just an amazingly efficient animal at taking feed and converting it to flesh. But here's two of our big products in the United States, catfish and trout. Equal to or better at converting food to flesh than these warm-blooded animals. And if you had biology, you know what the reason for this is. They're cold-blooded animals. A lot of the energy that a warm-blooded animal takes in when he eats is used to just maintain body temperature. And of course, this varies depending on the temperature of the ambient environment. But a lot of energy is just spent in temperature regulating. The other thing is, fish float in the water. They don't have to spend a lot of energy trying to maintain their position against gravity in the environment. There's other reasons too, but the point here is that cold-blooded animals, fish in particular, just happen to be very, very efficient at converting feed into edible tissue. And again, this has implications for any number of things. I'm going to use land use. And when I speak of land use in terms of this particular issue, the easiest thing to think of is just the facility. This is a bunch of ponds, so that's a land use. That's just the facility size. It could be a poultry house, it could be a feedlot, it could be whatever. So there's the facility. But all these animals, or most of them anyway, are raised on some sort of grain product, which soybean meal, corn, wheat, whatever it might be. And so there's a lot of land that's used just to raise these food crops that are put into feed. So that becomes part of the overall footprint of raising this animal, and that's important. Now again, fish are very efficient at converting feed into flesh. So when you look at land use, this is exactly what you would think would happen. Here's beef, here's swine, poultry, and catfish. Follows the exact same kind of pattern That's just the feed efficiency, which makes sense. And so much of the land used to raise these animals is used to raise the feed. There was a study done not too long ago by Hallie Froelich at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she took a good bit of data. There's some very interesting assumptions made on how demographics will change in the future, how food choices will change in the future, how much more efficient we will get raising both animals and plants and so on. But she took 3 scenarios and looked at them. The first was, here's just business as usual, and these are global numbers, these are not United States numbers, but about 1 billion metric tons of grains, feed products, are used to raise the animals that we eat. And they're divided up roughly the way I show them. There were also other animals in there that I just sort of, for simplicity of the graph, just threw them in there. And then the next scenario was looking at all of these changes that will occur in the next 30 years. How much feed, in other words, these grains, will be used to support the animal production in the world if everything just increases the same way. You know, we eat about the same proportion of beef and the same proportion of chicken and so forth. And it ends up being about 3 billion tons of feed crops will be used to support that animal production. And then they looked at what would happen if a substantial portion of that increase in meat production was taken up by raising aquaculture products. They made some assumptions in there that were sort of interesting about, you know, we will continue to eat certain things, eggs I think were one of them, and so forth, and also some changes again in efficiency of production. But they came up with that, whoops, let me go back there, with that comparison there. About a little bit less than a third of the total grain production would be used in what they called an aquaculture dominant world. In other words, if all we did was to substitute aquatic products for the increase in meat consumption over the years. The final sentence, I think it was, in this publication was pretty obvious. Just millions of acres of land would be spared in the world for other uses, say raising grain products or vegetable products or whatever, if a substantial portion of human diets would switch to aquatic products. So it's a wise choice just in terms of where the future is going to be. This generalization of we're more efficient, animals, cold-blooded animals are more efficient at using food than warm-blooded animals. This corresponds also to changes in how efficient energy use is. In other words, we have that same sort of general trend with energy use per kilogram of animal produced, greenhouse gas emissions, and water use. So all of these resource inputs, which are mainly used to produce the feed that we use to grow these animals, are lower when you compare them to terrestrial animals. So it's a very efficient fish to raise. The next, using these, I said I was going to use a couple of specific examples on a completely changed topics now. Instead of resource use, I'm going to look at impacts. And this is a publication by the Environmental Defense Fund in 1997. They made an assessment of what they thought were some of the major impacts of US aquaculture on the environment. One thing they focused in on very heavily was pollution. All animals that are raised in agriculture produce a waste. You feed the animal retains a certain portion of the feed, the nutrients in the feed, and the rest are excreted as waste. Fish are no different. Aquatic animals are no different. And they really focused in on this one issue of the pollution issue. And actually, they strongly lobbied the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, at that time. And EPA developed, as part of a rulemaking process, a law, a rule, to limit aquacultural effluents. This was a 5 or 6 year project, and there's probably a half dozen or more people in this room that were part of this process. It was very interesting, and somebody else has already picked up on this, is that there were a lot of misconceptions about what aquaculture really does. The people in EPA didn't know a lot about aquaculture, And the publication Murky Waters sort of painted with a very broad brush that led EPA to believe that aquaculture is a bad polluting industry. And what they found out was that this was not true. And I'm going to give two examples here of exactly where we stand with respect to this one issue that became so important, which is pollution. I'm going to look at the two, this has already been mentioned, the two largest aquaculture industries in the United States along with mollusks, catfish and trout. I'm going to start with catfish. Catfish are raised in northern ponds that don't really discharge except for periods of very heavy rainfall, primarily in the winter. In other words, they just capture rainfall. They're not drained for years at a time. So they're essentially just capturing rainfall over time. Very little discharge. And these are the major catfish producing in the industries. I'll just point out, I think that Carol did, if you look at these are some of the more economically depressed areas in the United States where catfish farming is a very important part of rural economic development. I'm going to look at a particular area. This is the Mississippi Delta. This is where I live. This is in northwest Mississippi, very flat. It's where most of the catfish are raised. I'm going to look at a small watershed in the southern delta. It's called the Wolf Lake Watershed. There's a lake down there that had become very polluted over time. And EPA, the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality, and some university researchers became involved in looking at what are the pollutant contributors to this lake. And on the side there, you can see the approximate breakdown of the land use in that area. Most of it was in cropland, primarily soybeans. A good bit of it was still in native hardwood forests. Some of it in pastures, and a fair amount of it was in catfish ponds. And it's a rural area, so a little bit in residential. So they quantified the inputs of all these different pollutants that were going into Wolf Lake and saying, what are the major contributors to polluting that lake? This graph's a little bit bizarre. That dotted line in the middle, it's really looking at the proportion based on the land use. That dotted line in the middle means that's one. That means that you're contributing pollution exactly in proportion to your land use. Like if you represent a particular land use represents 25% of the land that's contributing 25% of the pollutants. Anything above that dotted line means you're polluting in excess of what land you're using. If it's on the other side, less. But here's the way it ended up. And I'm going to show you this graph, and the same thing. This is for phosphorus contribution, which is a major pollutant in most waters. What this means is you'll notice that catfish was at the bottom in the smallest little bar on the bottom of each of these. And row crops were at the top. Row crops, this is just erosion off the row crops. When it rains hard, the erosion comes off. It contributes soil particles. Any of the phosphorus fertilizer that was put on the soil is washed into the streams and then into the lake. Catfish ponds were the lowest contributor of pollutants of any land use per acre in the area. I had a person from Mississippi DEQ tell me that if the entire watershed was catfish ponds, that lake would revert back to a completely unpolluted state. In other words, it was by far the least polluting land use of anything on that watershed. Next, I'll move to Idaho. This has already been mentioned. This is trout country. And the little circle there is the middle Snake River Valley, where about 70% of the trout in the United States are grown. This is a beautiful area. This is a vacation destination, especially if you're a fish farmer and really want to see some interesting aquaculture. A very precious resource. There's the whole Snake River Valley is composed of volcanic rock. It's very porous, and so snow melt on the mountains all around the Snake River Valley melt, seep into the ground, and then come gushing out of the sides of this canyon in these huge, beautiful springs. And quite a few of them they fall right out of the side of the mountain, and they go right through a trout farm, and they used to raise trout. This is a classic example. This is a sort of a large to medium-sized trout farm in the Snake River Valley. That's the Snake River on the right. And you can see, I think, some of the springs that are coming out of the sides of the mountains there. They, whoops, go back, they fall out of the mountain, they run one time through these raceways, and then they're discharged out into the Snake River. So they run 24 hours a day. There's no water that's wasted here or used. It just flows in and out, and the fish are raised in them, so there's no water that's actually used. It's just used to hold the fish while they're being fed. Both of these, the springs and the river, are, as I said, precious resources and want to be highly protected. And so over the years, this is the effluent coming out of one of the trout farms. Over the years, both the federal government, this has been mostly back around the year 2000, the federal government and the Idaho State Department of Environmental Quality imposed extraordinarily strict standards on the pollutants that could come out of trout farms. At the time, they were so strict that it didn't look like, I think most of the trout farmers thought that we will never be able to meet this. We will never be able to meet the standards that are being imposed upon us. There was a lot of money spent, a lot of USDA funds that went into funding research on modifying the trout diets, modifying the way the wastes are treated, modifying the way the fish are raised and so forth, in order to make these fish much more efficient at retaining the nutrients and discharging a pristine water at the end. And so they were given a limit that was very strict, like I said. But through this research, they not only met the limit, but they unbelievably exceeded it by a lot. That top line, these are just in percentages. That top line, rather than putting a pounds of phosphorus or something like that there, that's just essentially 100% of what these trout farms were allocated. That was how much phosphorus they could discharge, and those dotted lines are what they're actually discharging. So they not only met these very strict standards, about 50%, you can see they're discharging far less than what they're allowed to discharge. And again, just an amazing result based on research and what the industry did for themselves. These are just some summaries. Again, this was a very difficult topic because each of these, as we've already heard, each of these types of aquaculture has totally different impacts and so forth. But there are some generalities that I think you should know. And then the final two slides are really the only two things you need to know. First of all, extractive aquaculture, things like seaweeds and mussels and so forth, have a net positive benefit for the environment. They take up pollutants, they clean the water up, they dissipate wave energy, they can protect shorelines, and they're an economic driver in the areas where they're raised. This next one is that fish are just inherently, by their nature, an extremely efficient fish to raise. They convert feed efficiently. And that has implications for all sorts of resource use, whether it's land, energy, water, greenhouse gases, whatever it might be. They're just very efficient. Oops. And aquaculture is just a clean industry, as these last two examples have shown. I want to make a statement, just explain this thing right under there that says bias nature. Again, I mentioned at the beginning that a lot of my work in the past has been towards working within the culture system. In other words, trying to maintain in the culture system a clean environment so the fish grows well. And that's extremely important, both the trout farmers, catfish farmers, it doesn't matter where you are. The goal is to keep the water clean so that the fish grow well. So that's just a part of raising fish, is to maintain a good environment, which then leads to an effluent that is minimally a problem. And then, as Carol has mentioned, effluents in the United States from all aquaculture facilities are highly regulated, so it's a clean industry. These next two slides are really what I want you to know, and the reason this is important is because this is a quote from Jason Clay with the World Wildlife Fund. The World Wildlife Fund is a pretty strident environmental organization. And they've done a lot of work and worked with the catfish industry, the aquaculture industry across the world, and have been important for some really significant changes in what aquaculture has done over the years. They made a study a few years ago, and this is on their website, where they looked at sort of the collision course of our resource use in the world and how much the resources are used by agriculture, and the fact that at some point it's going to be kind of tough. We're using more resources than we can sustain based on the increase in food consumption over years. The numbers don't mean a thing. The 40% and the 2050, those are just the numbers they came up with in their modeling. The point is only a fool would believe that the Earth does not have finite resources, that our resources are limited. And our population is growing, and our food use is changing. And at some point, there's going to be a problem. The solution is going to make make agriculture, food production in general, more efficient. That's the only way we can move forward. Research, particularly in the United States, has done impressive jobs of increasing resource use efficiency and so forth in food production. But according to the World Wildlife Fund, Jason Clay, to return to a balance with nature, we have to make dramatic improvements. And this was his conclusion. No other food production system in the world has made the improvements that aquaculture has. And only aquaculture has proven that these changes are possible, that we can improve to the point where we can meet these standards that are going to be needed to meet the future food uses. So with that, if there's a time for any questions, I'll be glad to give it a whirl.
So Kurt, you said that the leading polluters in the Mississippi study were ag dominated, so it's it's corn, soy, and wheat. As the industry grows,
That's true at the Snake River Valley. That's probably true in the United States.
So as the industry grows, how can they feed their animals without impacting more production of the row crop that are the highest polluters?
Well, again, you combine two things and it becomes pretty obvious. That one study by Hallie Froelich that shows that land use will actually decrease if we raise more aquatic animals. That means that land use in general to raise crops could decrease if we raise more aquatic animals. So that would be it. In other words, it's sort of an indirect thing. Raising more aquatic animals uses less land to raise the feeds, and therefore pollution from these non-point source pollution, non-point sources like row crops, would possibly decrease over time. Thanks.
People ask us all the time, what makes Mount Lassen Trout Farms so different, so special? It's simple. It's the environment. Everything we do centers around one thing: spring water. The lifeblood of our farms and the lifeblood of our future. The constant ideal water temperatures, the velocity of water that flows through our farms, the care we take when handling our fish, every aspect of the rearing process is constantly scrutinized, and nothing is taken for granted. We maintain our own broodstock, so we have complete control of the quality of our product throughout all of the life stages. We can trace the heritage of every single fish we produce for generations back. We are a family company with a dedicated staff that is second to none. We work with amazing distributors and chefs like Aaron Casiva at Single Threads Restaurant, who take the same care and preparation that we do in rearing to ensure that what is provided is the freshest, healthiest, and most delicious fish on the market. That is what sets us apart.
Trout Growers Association of the US. So hopefully that'll move that agency along quite a bit to all work together. I'm going to make a couple of comments on Dr. Tucker's, and I know I'm in between you guys and lunch, but two things. I live in Kentucky. I'm going to say one word, bourbon. Okay? I'm sure all of us, every once in a while, are taking a little bit of bourbon. The one good thing about the aquaculture industry, there's been some research done at the Kentucky State University to be the secondary user of distilled brewer's grains. As we know in the US, one of our fast-growing industries is microbreweries. And the bourbon industry is exploding. But what do we do with those distillers grains after their first use of the bourbon industry or the beer industry is used? It can go into some fish feed. We've done a little bit of research into cattle, but there is still some very usable proteins in that. So we might also have some expanse in Dr. Tucker's not using those land uses, but being the secondary user of some of those waste products from other industries. And fisheries and aquaculture is a prime example of where we can use those to supplement the feed. So that's just a thought. The other secondary thing in that Snake River, if you ever get a chance to go out there, it's absolutely beautiful. But some of those farms, because of the EPA requirements, have now taken and put turbines onto that incoming water. And not only are they generating beautiful fish and high protein products, they're putting water back out, but they're also generating thousands and thousands and thousands of kilowatts of electricity that are going back into those local environments at a reasonable cost for those local areas. One farm in particular produces about $30,000 of electricity every month being sold back into that community just from the water that's going to flow through it anyway. So there's a lot of innovative ways that aquaculture is used and part of all of our everyday life, even if you're not a fish eater, but yet just a regular consumer. So just a couple of thoughts on that. For lunch, which I believe is ready to go, it is sponsored by the US Aquaculture Society. Again, like Dr. Engel had mentioned, we are an educational branch of US Aquaculture. We're a nonprofit chapter of the World Aquaculture Society, which has 5 chapters now. Africa just started. We have Central America, Asia, Central and Latin America, and now an African chapter. So innovation throughout the world is being shared through our World Aquaculture Society and our chapters like this. Also a big sponsor is the Soy Aquaculture Alliance, and in your package you picked up downstairs this brochure on how they've changed a lot of their innovative research and support for research through some of their aquaculture and soybean research and development. They are members of Soybean Farmers that make up their membership with domestic markets and their potential for supporting the aquaculture. They increase the utilization of US soybeans in diets of fish and shrimp throughout their affiliations with academia and private researchers and industry leaders. They're governed by a total volunteer board representing the US soybean farmers and industry members. So they've been very, very supportive in this event, and we need to thank them. Also, the other is the National Aquaculture Association, which is in existence for about 30 years, and it's a unified national voice for aquaculture that ensures its sustainability, protects its profitability, and encourages its development with an environmentally responsible and sustainable manner. It's a nonprofit trade association supported solely through the membership, which is made up of the farmers, businesses, and researchers that provide farmers and equipment, feed manufacturers, the vets that work with our fish and medicines, transportation, processing, and all the other support services that aquaculture needs in both research and extension. So we want to thank wholeheartedly the National Aquaculture Association and the Soybean Aquaculture Association for their support in this event. Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Rex Rode, who is with USDA. You tell him all your stuff. It's too long to mention.
I'm not going to tell him all this stuff, but I'll tell him something.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk a little bit today about the federal aquaculture research, education, and extension effort that we have. Part of my job at USDA is to make sure that we have our research priorities set such that they actually benefit the industries that we serve. And so that means a lot of connecting with stakeholders, understanding the challenges that they have, and understanding the capacity that we have in our agency to be able to address some of those priorities with science-based methods. So with that, it's important to connect with stakeholders. It's also important to connect with other folks in the federal sector, and that we have a lot of interagency coordination. There's a lot of work that can be done, and there's no reason that we should be duplicative in our efforts. And so a lot of opportunity to interact with our other colleagues. So in putting together this talk, I put together some thoughts that are part of a collective effort that we have. So there's a lot of influence from our agency at ARS, but also from the other folks in the room that we work with, and I very much appreciate their contributions. So I often, when I'm talking about aquaculture and our investment, turn back to the National Aquaculture Policy that came from the 1980 Act that has been referenced this morning, and in particular this last sentence: it is therefore in the national interest and in the national policy to encourage the development of aquaculture in the United States. And for me, and for many of the folks that I work with, we are encouraging aquaculture in the U.S. through research, through education, and through the extension programs that have been set up in our respective agencies. So a lot of this has been discussed already today, our capacity for aquaculture in the U.S., capacity for expanding aquaculture in the U.S. We have a great regulatory framework. We have capacity for innovation and technology development. This is across many sectors, and also including, I would highlight, agriculture. We're a major producer of fish feed ingredients. We have abundant aquatic resources. We are an agriculture nation. We have the most agricultural exports in the world. And so we really have a foundation that will serve us well to be able to have science-based expansion here domestically. Also point out low aquaculture production, high seafood consumption, about a $20 billion seafood trade deficit that we have. And as part of USDA and Health and Human Services look at the dietary guidelines and their recommendations, Americans only eat half of what the recommendations say at this point. So a lot of capacity, a lot of justification for aquaculture here in the U.S. Being in the federal government, there's a lot of agencies that touch aquaculture. So I've listed them here. This is a snapshot that was taken a few years back. Everybody that does research involved with science, involved with policy, trade, or any kind of aspect related to aquaculture. So for this reason, we have what we refer to as a subcommittee on aquaculture. Again, this was authorized by the National Aquaculture Act of 1980. Back then, we referred to it as a joint subcommittee on aquaculture. It's been referred to as the Interagency Working Group on Aquaculture, and now the subcommittee on aquaculture that sits under the Committee on Environment. The idea here is to prepare coordinated research and development strategies and recommendations for accomplishing national goals, and then also serving as a federal interagency coordinating group that can have agencies talking to each other here in our nation's capital. So as Jeff mentioned this morning, aquaculture is agriculture, and it's also complex. Here I've highlighted what we consider in ARS in terms of agricultural food production systems, where you have to consider the genetics that are going to go into the system, the environment where the system is located, the management practices that will be implemented, post-harvest treatment of products, and also the social factors and the marketing and all the things that go into that. When you consider the complexity of all these issues and the need that we have science and technology development to support them, but also to support the policy around them and how we treat the different factors that we have. For instance, genetically modified organisms have seen some need for regulation in agriculture and animals, both in plants. The environmental systems, management systems, biosecurity, fish health management, both within a company and in an industry. All these things are important and require an investment in science and technology. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the rationale for federal aquaculture research. As I mentioned, aquaculture is complex. We have many species. I've seen where it's upwards of 300, some species that are cultured here in the U.S. As Craig pointed out, there's maybe 30 or so that are the main species that we're producing. You have many production systems. You have the ponds, the raceways, the recirculating aquaculture systems, and so on. But I think the most important rationale for this is that we have many small businesses. I think it's been estimated that we have around 5,000 aquaculture companies in this country, and most of those are small operations that lack their own capacity for research and development. So this is where the federal government can step in and support it. Supporting economic development in rural and coastal communities we've heard about, forming policies decisions is something that's inherently governmental, and so it's important that we have the capacity to do that. I see that the federal government is really has a role as convening industry, so these are folks that are sometimes competing, sometimes working together, but it's important that we serve that role, trying to look out for various industries on behalf of the nation. And then I think it's incredibly important that we support extension and education. So I tend to think about things in the research realm, but the extension is important. We have to get these technologies on farm, get them implemented, and the education is important, especially when it comes to developing our workforce. So one of the things that I've been asked to do is to lead the development of a federal research support, federal research strategic plan for aquaculture. And so the title of it, Federal Research Supporting Sustainable and Responsible Aquaculture in the U.S. There's a previous version of this plan that will sunset this year, and so we're looking forward at the next 5 years. And this is a draft, so I'm going to tell you kind of where we're at this point in time. But the vision that we laid out was a globally competitive, science and technology-driven sector that meets increasing demands for aquatic products that are affordable and meet high standards for safety, quality, and environmental stewardship, while providing new opportunities for profitability and economic growth. And so I think we have an incredibly complex task, and this is something that we're trying to capture in the draft of 30 pages to outline what we see are the priorities. So in this plan, there were some of the things that we wanted to consider in developing, communicating federal priorities for research, science, and technology development. We wanted to lay out a framework for interagency coordination. And when it comes to aquaculture, in USDA we tend to be food production driven, but we wanted this plan to be inclusive. We wanted it to include food production, the aquaria trade, recreational, commercial fisheries. The ecosystem services has been mentioned here today, and rebuilding stocks of threatened or endangered species. So since the last plan was developed and released, there have been some major advancements that we've had, and we thought it would be important to comment on these, and some of these have been discussed already. We mentioned rural and coastal communities and economic development. Human health, the benefits of seafood and human health is something that we feel has been understated in the past. Modernizing agriculture, we're seeing tremendous gains in the ability to farm all species. It's not just the gains that we're making in aquaculture, but in livestock production, in crops. We have precision agriculture technologies that are being developed. Aquaculture needs to be a part of that. Seaweed production has been mentioned, aquaponics, the ability to combine production systems between plants and animals, the development of recirculating aquaculture systems that are coming online, seeing large capital investments to develop and use this technology here in the U.S. And then a lot of excitement about the opportunities that we have for offshore aquaculture. So quickly, we have 3 goals that we are outlining in this plan, and I wanted to share those and some of the major objectives that we have. The first, provide rural America and coastal communities with new economic opportunities. And so here in the first bullet, we were thinking about communicating about aquaculture. It's got, in some communities, kind of a bad connotation, and so we wanted to ask the question, how do we change that? How do we provide good information to the public that they can understand the economic and environmental benefits of aquaculture? Second, conduct socioeconomic research to remove constraints to aquaculture and identify market opportunities for U.S. farm seafood. What should we be growing? What are the opportunities? We have a large investment in catfish, and we should maintain that. But what are the other species out there that have great potential that we should invest in as well? Educate and train a skilled aquaculture workforce. Even in ARS, when we go to hire scientists to find one that has an aquaculture background to come in and work on our projects can sometimes be difficult. So we're bringing in people from outside aquaculture, and we're training them to work in this area. It's critically important that we're able to train people to work in this field. And then finally, enable science-based expansion of aquaculture, and this is kind of what we refer to sometimes as the tools for rules. What are the information that's needed to develop policy around aquaculture and the ability to expand here in the U.S. Improve aquaculture production technologies and management tools. So this is where we typically work. This is in USDA, providing farmers with access to improved genetics for aquaculture species without impacting resident populations. We were just talking about this a minute ago. where breeding and selection and genome-enabled activities fall under this, but also other species that limit the reproductive capability of farm fish so that if they did escape, they would not have an impact on resident populations. Safe and effective tools and technologies to enhance and commercialize production of promising species. As I mentioned, there's many species out there that are native that we could be farming. What is it going to take to get them to market where that's currently being supplied with fisheries? Next, define and meet the nutrient requirements of cultured species, and I would even add in every stage of their life cycle. So when they are young, when they're first reared, all the way through their development to broodstock, what is their nutrient? What are their nutrient requirements, and what is the best way to meet those in an economically sustainable way? And then finally, improve engineering systems for aquaculture production. And we've seen tremendous progress in this area, both with recirculation systems and the split pond systems that we have with catfish and other systems as well. So third goal, essentially enhance implementation of One Health approaches for aquaculture. Here we were thinking primarily in two ways. One, develop safe and effective biologics and pharmaceuticals to protect animal, human, and environmental health and well-being. And then the second, promote and demonstrate the safety and healthfulness of domestic farm-raised seafood products. And so there's kind of the animal health component to this and the food safety that we think is critically important. And looking at a One Health approach, as I've laid out here, the interaction of host, pathogen, and environment to reduce on-farm losses to disease. So I thought it would be important to talk a little bit about federal research implementation. We basically have two strategies for this. One is our intramural system of federal labs across all the agencies that have the capacity to do long-term research. We think it's important that they are stable focal points for activities that require a long-term investment. And some of these might include having test or demonstration sites, hatcheries, feed mills, pilot-scale grow-out opportunities, multi-generational genetics and breeding populations, and disease diagnostics as we have in many state and federal labs. We think it's important that these labs be responsive to federal goals and regulatory needs, and so something that, as I mentioned before, we find to be inherently governmental. And then having risk factors that we're able to take on that are a little bit higher than what the industry can do for itself. It's something that, being mostly small businesses, is something that the federal government should support in terms of taking on risk. In extramural support, we're talking about support for universities, the private sector, and even sometimes other federal agencies. These are shorter term projects, typically 1 to 4 years, and they're going to range, have a wide diversity of topics that they'll cover, new species, the kind of projects that don't take a long-term investment, but may lead to a long-term investment depending on their outcomes. They typically have strong education and outreach components, and again, the risk factors can be elevated compared to intramural supported research as well. I think one of the most important things that I've seen is that when we have the ability to integrate the intramural and the extramural programs, we come out with value-added products that are critically important for supporting our industries. And so I would say that the integration of these two capacities is extremely important. I have to mention opportunities for public-private partnerships. I think that our federal research should be stakeholder-driven in terms of engaging stakeholders to help set the priorities for what we work on, what we use our research capacity for, determining the value of expected outcomes. If our research is successful, will it matter? As opposed to the value of research products. So how well did we do? Is this a successful program? And is this program having an impact on your industry as we would expect? We need these partnerships for technology development so that we can take things from a laboratory scale to a commercial scale with capacity that we would not have in the federal program. Transfer and commercialized technologies is related to that. And then also in terms of workforce development, we need to make sure that we are supporting the education and training of employees who are going to go on to be a part of the aquaculture workforce. So one of my roles and the roles of the subcommittee that I have the opportunity to participate on is strategic planning. And I pointed out just some of the documents that have come out here in the last several years that are influencing the way we're doing research. The first aquaculture genetics, genomics, and breeding in the United States. We had a US country report on aquatic genetic resources many of you helped with. We kind of took an inventory of what we're producing in the US and how we're producing it. We had a marine fish aquaculture scoping workshop in 2017 and a follow-on workshop in 2019, where we looked at if we're going to have offshore aquaculture or marine aquaculture here in the U.S., what are the next set of finfish species that we would want to develop. And so we brought together folks from industry, academia, and government to be able to work on that list. Genetic improvement in the United States is a work that's in progress, but making sure we all have kind of inventory of the genetic technologies that are available, both for selective breeding and controlling the genetics of farm populations. Genome to phenome I'll talk about in a minute. And then also the last one is the National Strategic Plan for Federal Aquaculture Research that we'll be updating. So I think one of the most important documents that's come out recently is the Science Breakthroughs to Advance Food in Agriculture Research by 2030. Of the chapters in this volume, only one of them is dedicated to animal research, and only a portion of that is dedicated to aquaculture. And so what they highlight, and I'll read the last sentence here, the urgent progress needed today to address the most challenging problems requires leveraging capabilities across the scientific and technological enterprise in a convergent research approach. What they're saying is we used to do science in kind of silos, where we had geneticists over there, we had engineers over there, we had nutrition people somewhere else, and they didn't really talk to each other. And that has to come to an end, because this is one production system that we have, and our efforts should be concerted with one another. So they call for a twofold increase in animal protein. And they listed two ways that this would happen: a tenfold increase in the rate of genetic improvement and the development of precision livestock production systems. Had I been an author, I might say that, well, we can expand aquaculture and we're just using a bigger footprint to produce animal protein. That would be kind of the third bullet item. But if we look at our best technologies that we've developed to increase the rate of genetic improvement, our best case scenario gives a twofold improvement. So we really are going to have to use all of the technologies at our disposal to be able to increase the amount of protein that we're going to need for our future global population. So with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about this document. So from animal genomes to phenomes, how do we get from genetics to the phenotype and things that actually matter on the farm? There was a previous version of this that came out and kind of laid out some of the things that needed to be accomplished in the previous decade. They used three themes: science to practice, discovery, science, and infrastructure. And I've got a puzzle diagram here to kind of show how we see these things fitting together. And so in doing the revision, there were initially 14 species that were targeted. We opened this up because we felt like this couldn't be inclusive of all the aquaculture species that we work on, and that so much has changed about the way we do genetics and genomics research these days, that there were just more opportunities and a much bigger community working in this area. And so if you look at the priorities that were highlighted, this is a publication that has over 100 contributors that we're looking at everything science and practice. It's pretty much how do we breed these animals and how do we manage them on the farm for optimizing production. Discovery science is a lot of the basic information that we need to be able to do that. And then the infrastructure, everything from the genome sequences, the education for the workforce, biotechnology, and a lot of the populations that we have access to for aquaculture production. So I think one of the best cases that we outlined in that publication was the US dairy industry, where we've seen traumatic gains over the last decade, and where we started using genomics in breeding programs. You can see we got increasingly higher rates of gain. There was an industry that was started. Right here we're showing where animals reside that were genotyped, and so getting a DNA fingerprint from an animal was something that was kind of unheard of when we got into this process. And 10 years later, we've got an entire private sector industry that has started around offering genotyping services to farmers and the livestock industry. And so what this has done, there's a $100 million research investment over 10 years, and this is by USDA. They saw gains of $50 per cow, 9 million cows. You look at the return on investment, and it ends up being around 40 to 1. So we consider that this is one of the best scenario outcomes from this kind of research, but just something that we can use in aquaculture as a goal. This is an industry that when they started had already gone hundreds of years of selection. And so in this example, we're just tweaking an industry, whereas in aquaculture, we have opportunities to create industries. And so a lot of opportunity here. So I couldn't move on without talking about this publication when we're singing the praises of federal aquaculture supported research. This is came from Dave Love with the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, an analysis of $1 billion of aquaculture grants by the U.S. federal government from 1990 to 2015. So just to hit the highlights, there were about 3,000 grants they looked at across the various agencies, but it added up to a little over $1 billion worth of funding. And his analysis came out with a 37-fold return on investment. So this is something that all of the federally supported research across the nation can be very proud of. So with that, I'm very pleased to be able to work with a fine bunch of people here in the federal sector that have contributed to the scientific planning that's going on and the interagency coordination. As one of my colleagues here likes to say, we're from the government and we're here to help. And so that's kind of the mantra that we have. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
My wife Julie's a fifth generation farmer. I'm a sixth generation farmer. Rice has been in our blood as long as we can remember. We don't have a lot of rotational crops here in South Louisiana, but crawfish has really afforded us another rotation to help kind of offset some of those ups and downs of rice and soybeans and all that. And it grows very well with in conjunction with rice, you know, as a supplement to the rice rotation. We grow a rice crop. We'll harvest it in August. We'll flood it back in late October, November. We'll start harvesting crawfish well into the following year, and then we'll grow a rice crop the subsequent year. So it's a great rotation. It's very sustainable. It's very traceable. As farmers, we're the ultimate environmentalists, and you know we just want to leave this land better than it was for the next generation. All of our land is precision leveled through NRCS programs and meets all of their specs. Everything is zero grade. We have large patties, and it's flat. It's designed to hold water, which is very conducive for the rice crawfish rotation. We can hold shallow floods like in this field right here and really support a lot of the migratory birds. At the end of a crawfish season, it's been told to me that there's 146 different migratory birds, and we will hold this water after we're finished trapping crawfish. We'll release it and we'll dump it into a ditch, and then we have pumps, relift pumps in that same ditch. We're going to take all that water that just left that crawfish pond and we'll replace it onto a future crawfish pond or another rice field downstream. So we're trying to recycle as much of this water as we can, and I think that we're really getting close to 60 to 70% recycling. With the crop valued at over $200 million, crawfish is really huge to the local economy. If you use the agricultural number of multiplier of 7 as a crop that provides back, I mean, you're looking at over $1 billion worth of value. We're buying fuel for pumping, we're buying boats, we're buying traps, we're buying bait. All that money goes back into the local economy. We're hiring as many locals as we can. Rice and crawfish go really good together in the field, but they're also in the pot. They taste really good together. So it's definitely something. It's a relationship that that has evolved in South Louisiana, and it's something that's very important to us. We're loving the way that the crawfish rice rotation works, and we got 3 kids at home and hoping that we can pass the legacy on to them.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Our next speaker is Sebastian Bell, who's the Executive Director of the Maine Aquaculture Association and has been involved in aquaculture and fisheries for a million years.
Don't tell me.
I won't tell you how many years I've known him.
Good
He
afternoon,
was 10 when
everybody.
I met him.
She didn't disclose how long I've been in it. That's a good thing. So I'm, I think, the wrap-up speaker here, and I have the most boring subject to talk to you about of all. So you've had your lunch, and now I'm going to talk to you about regulations. So I'm sorry if I'm going to put you to sleep, and I'm also going to commit the cardinal flaw with PowerPoint presentations, lots of uninteresting slides. So we'll see how many of you hang in there. I'm going to start with an infomercial, which is about Maine aquaculture and who we are. We have 190 commercial farms in the state of Maine. We grow shellfish, finfish, sea vegetables. We have both land-based and ocean-based farms.
And we now also have a relatively large aquaponics facility, which is under construction now, and I think will be, when it's finished, will be the third largest aquaponics facility in the country. We have experienced a fairly significant amount of growth over the last 20 and even as recently as 10 years, and that's the reason I think in part I'm here to speak to you, is to talk to you about why we've had that growth and what lessons can be learned at a national level from that. So we have roughly 300 new farms in the state in the last 5 to 8 years. The value of our sector has tripled in the last 15 years in terms of its economic impact. And we have had roughly 30% growth in the acreage in the state in the last 5 years. So we're going through a fairly significant growth period. All of our farms except for one is owned by a family, and that one is a seaweed farm. It's a seaweed farm that has raised some capital on the market through stockholders. But every other of our farms is a family-owned farm, even our biggest farms. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay, so this is the backdrop for us nationally. I think those of you who are in the sector know this, but the reason I put it up here is because this is the comparison between our sector and other protein groups domestically. We grow a relatively small percentage of the seafood that is consumed in this country domestically. And so when I look at that slide, I view that as both a negative in the sense that we're obviously behind, but I also view it as an opportunity, as a positive. That space to the right, all that dark space that is not being grown in this country is an opportunity for us to serve that market. It's currently being served by product, as you've heard already, grown overseas. So let's look at the annual growth rate nationally and compare it to the international growth rate. And these numbers are a little out of date, but essentially aquaculture, as some of you probably know, is the fastest growing food production method in the world. It's been growing roughly 8% per year annually on a global basis. There are different numbers, some a little higher, some a little lower, but that's kind of the average number you hear. Aquaculture in the United States has grown roughly over the last 20 years, around 1%, but in recent years we've been contracting, and that's largely been driven by contraction in the catfish sector. And so actually the total economic value of aquaculture in the country has gone a little down, not up, in the last few years. So I want to challenge you to think about this in a slightly different way than you've heard before. We focus a lot on biology, we focus a lot on environmental impact, we focus a lot on research. I want you to think about aquaculture in terms of economic development, because the countries that we are competing against and the countries that have bigger sectors than our sector do precisely that. They view it as an economic development tool. And they are very premeditated about how they go about that, and that shapes their national policy and the kinds of programs that they put in place to develop the sector. And that's really what I want to focus on today. It's not complicated and it's not rocket science. It's actually pretty simple. It's really about establishing a set of conditions that give consumers confidence, and most importantly, give investors confidence to risk capital. So in the States, we've really lagged behind growth rates internationally, but we have the largest EEZ in the world. We have one of the largest and most diverse coastlines and marine ecosystems in the world. We are the second or third largest seafood market in the world, depending on whose numbers you believe in. And we have very significant freshwater resources. So why are we so far behind? Why aren't we accelerating more rapidly? And I really think it boils down to two simple things: barriers to entry and operating costs. And regulations have an impact on both of those, but I want to make sure I leave you with one message very clearly. Industry is not opposed to regulation. On the contrary, regulations are important to us for a number of reasons, not the least of which is well-constructed and enforced regulations prevent the emergence of irresponsible operators that do bad things that hurt the entire sector. So regulations can be a good thing. But they have to be smart, they have to be practical, and they have to be based on science in order to be effective. In order to have a sector grow, you have to establish a business climate where the investors are confident about and which allows them to invest. So there are things that are out of control of government that establish business climates. What's the opportunity cost for capital in the marketplace? What are interest rates? What are the competitive forces out there in the business world? Those are typically things that governments don't have a tremendous amount of ability to influence. Market demand. You obviously need market demand. You need a demand for the product that you're proposing to grow. If there's no demand, it doesn't matter how much investment you make, it will not be profitable. And you need available resources, obviously, as part of the equation. You need stuff, whatever that stuff is, that is used as the input into your production function. So governments and regulations certainly have an impact. They predominantly, I think, impact the business climate and the opportunities to get into a sector, but they're not the only thing that impact whether a sector takes off or not. These are kind of the, I would say, the core management components, if you will, of how economic development is stimulated, either by government or by non-government entities, whichever. So you need sites, right? You need to be able to get on sites. You need some financing options, and financing options are often dictated by commercial markets, not necessarily by government programs. But if you look at the early days of the Norwegian salmon industry as an example, or the early days of the shrimp industry in some of the other countries that it's developed, you will see that government financing played a very important role in the startup of those sectors. Didn't play a continuing role once those sectors began to get up and running. The commercial financial community became more important, but in the early days, government financing is important. You need a certain minimum infrastructure, and as an example of that, I'll say on the coastal plain, if you will, in the United States of America, access to commercial wharfs is a real issue. Working waterfronts are shrinking. They are being displaced by residential development. And if you can't get your product back off the water over a commercial wharf, doesn't matter what you grow, you're going to have a problem. So infrastructure is important, workforce is important. Anybody who's an employer in this room knows that workforce is a challenge in this day and age. It's hard to find people who are well qualified and capable, and aquaculture can be a pretty technical sector. Risk management tools is something that the traditional terrestrial agricultural community has benefited from for over 100 years, and USDA has played a very critical role in risk management tools. Risk management tools are especially important to the aquaculture sector and growing that sector because, number one, it's a risky business. Our production cycle tends to be longer. So if you're growing something for 3 years, your risk is higher than if you're growing something for 6 months. And particularly for new farmers that don't have a financial buffer, if they don't have some risk management tools, a single crop failure may be the end of that business. And so risk management tools are very important. Regulatory clarity and stability, and this is really what I'm here to talk to you a little bit about today, and I'll talk a little bit more on that. And then consistent and economic juvenile supply is also a really important piece to the development for the aquaculture sector. If you look at any country in the world that started the sector from nothing, they typically had government hatchery and breeding programs that were the beginning of those sectors. That eventually gets taken over by the commercial sector. The commercial sector moves in, capitalizes those programs, builds their own hatcheries, builds their own breeding and selection programs. But again, in the early days of those sectors, government breeding and hatchery programs were very important. So, this is the terror slide that I put up there. For people who believe that we are not regulated. That is the list of either acts or authorities, depending on what you grow and where you grow it, that have some ability to impact your business. And it's a moving target. It changes quite frequently, and oftentimes there can be conflicting requirements between agencies or acts. I want to just shout out to Michael Rubino and the work that he's doing that's a parallel work to what CARE just presented on, which is this regulatory is it the regulatory streamlining?
The Regulatory Task Force.
Thank you, Michael. The Regulatory Task Force. I think that work is going to prove to be very, very important as we go forward here from the private sector to figure out how we have regulations which are perhaps more nimble and more effective without being barriers to the development of the sector. I'm hopeful that that work will not only document what we currently are dealing with, but will also make recommendations in terms of how duplicity can be eliminated and how permitting and licensing can be streamlined. So, oops, I went the wrong way. Sorry, guys. Okay. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of what I think are examples of either a lack of regulatory clarity or a case of regulatory instability. And the reason that regulatory instability is important is because when investors look at investing in a sector, if they feel like the regulations are going to change during that investment cycle, in other words, if the goalposts are going to move, that makes them less likely to invest in that sector. And I would argue that in part that's been part of the history of aquaculture in the US, as we've suffered from the moving goalpost phenomenon. So first example, and this is an example of perhaps regulatory clarity, not stability, is aquatic animal health in this country. We have 3 agencies that assert authority over aquatic animal health: USDA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA Fisheries. And depending on what you're growing, where you're growing it, how you're growing it, you may have to comply with 1, 2, or even in some cases 3 of those requirements. Those agencies have signed an MOU amongst themselves, and I think the frustration from the private sector, and this will be no news to anybody from those agencies in this room, is that essentially that MOU historically has said we're going to do what we've been doing. It hasn't really clarified or eliminated overlaps of authority. So I would argue that that's been a problem for us from the private sector, and it's been a problem in 2 ways. One is we have currently no national program on aquatic animal health, and as a result of that, that impacts the private sector 2 ways. One is if you are in the business of exporting something to another country, that country will come back to you and say, you don't have a national aquatic animal health program, and therefore we don't trust the safety of your product, and we're going to ask you to inspect at a higher level than we would normally. So it increases costs from an inspection and verification point of view. The other impact of not having a national program is for interstate commerce, at least, with the exception of Fish and Wildlife in Title 50, interstate commerce is essentially effectively regulated by the states. And so each state has their own set of regulations. And if you're in a business which exports to multiple states, you may have to comply with multiple states' different regulations. And so that makes it, again, very expensive. If any of you know Bill Kelleher, who runs Kennebec River Biosciences, his business is based on providing health certificates to people who are shipping stuff between states. And he will tell you at length that he has a single staff person that does nothing but track the rules and regulations on a state-by-state basis, on an annual basis, because it's a moving target. They're all moving and changing. And so he's expending literally tens of thousands of dollars just to keep up to speed with those regulatory changes. So that's an example of regulatory clarity and how that can be challenging to the private sector. Regulatory stability, I would argue, a possible example of it. We don't know whether this is in fact going to be the case or not, but if you're in the finfish world, you have to get an NPDES permit. And if you're in the marine environment and you're thinking about potentially operating in federal waters, there are some suggestions for federal legislation that would suggest that there may be permits or leases or licenses that are going to be issued by NOAA Fisheries or Department of Commerce. And then there are also requirements for NPDES permits. And the question is, if the NPDES permits have a set of conditions on them that are designed to protect the environment, will NOAA impose additional environmental restrictions, or does the NPDES permit conditions satisfy what NOAA needs? So we don't know what that is. I have a great deal of faith in Michael and his team at the agency. I suggest that they will probably make some good practical choices. But they may not be the people who make that decision. It may be Congress that makes that decision, and Congress may be told to impose additional requirements on those permits that are either duplicative or in some cases more extreme than the NPS permits that we would normally comply with from a fin fish point of view. And then the final example of regulatory instability is probably the classic one, and anybody who's been around for a while remembers this, the organic standards, right? So some of us worked on organic standards for 18 years, and we still don't have a set of organic standards nationally. We've had at least 2 recommendations from the NOSB board to the National Organics Program, and we've had, to my knowledge, and I'm probably not in the know, is my guess, but I think we've had at least 3 different rule versions internally that have been written and rewritten depending on what administration was in power and what their proclivities were to organic standards for aquaculture or not, and we still have no rule. What does that mean to us as a private sector? That means that we are competing against product which is certified as organic in other countries, and that's roughly about 1% of the seafood market in the United States of America. Roughly 2% of food in general is organic, and that's climbing. Roughly 1% of seafood consumed in the US is certified under some sort of organic standard. Those organic standards, many of them, are nowhere near as close to the strict standards that were being proposed in the US. In fact, they're significantly lax compared to US standards. But what that means is domestic growers are competing against product in the marketplace that is labeled as organic that may in fact be less organic than what they are actually growing with no standard in the United States. And I'll give you an example. In the state of Maine, we haven't used antibiotics for 5 years in our salmon industry, okay? Under European standards, for organic standards, you can use antibiotics twice before you harvest that fish and put it on the market as certified as organic. So that's a concrete example of the kinds of competitive disadvantage we are at. So those are 3 examples of either lack of clarity or instability. And there are, I think, many, many more. I could certainly poll colleagues of mine, and they would certainly have plenty of stories to tell about this kind of stuff. Why does this matter? This is work that Carl Engel and her colleague Jonathan Van Setten did, and it shows the cost of some of these regulations. And in particular, I just want to draw your attention to the fish health component. So this is for the US salmon producing industry, and essentially what Carol and Jonathan found, and Carol, you correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but roughly 7% of the regulatory cost in that sector is to do with fish health regulations. Now, there will be a cost associated with fish health inspection and certification, and that's a legitimate cost, right? We want to be inspected, we want to be certified. But the fact that there are 3 agencies that are involved in this space, probably in most cases in salmon it's 2, US Fish and Wildlife Service and US Department of Agriculture, and then the state agencies would be the 3rd group of agencies. That drives costs up. Ironically, USDA is the competent authority under the OIE International Treaty, and I will tell you from my perspective, we need to have one program in this country. It needs to be in USDA, and that's the program that needs to regulate farmed aquatic animals in this country. And the other programs are important to protect wildlife, but they should not regulate farmed product. Okay, so I've talked a lot about regulations, but regulations are only a part of the development equation. And that's probably, if I leave you with one message, that's the message I want to leave you with. Regulations are important, but all they do is tell you what you can do. They don't help you necessarily do it. And so if you look at the development plans in other countries, regulations are important, but there's a whole slew of other things that they do to stimulate development in that sector. And those are areas that we really are behind on in this country. So I want to propose, and this is not a new idea, I've been whining about this for a bunch of years, and I'm going to keep whining about it. I want to propose that we need a national aquatic animal, a national aquaculture economic development plan.
The other one too, Spanish.
Yeah. I'm getting excited about this, Bill. So I think we just need to model it on what other countries have done. This isn't rocket science, as I said earlier. I think it's obviously, from a structural point of view, it's got to be a public-private partnership. There needs to be connection between the private sector and the public agencies. I would argue that it needs to be multi-agency. Ag and Commerce need to lead it. This sounds starting to sound familiar, guys, to the structure of the committee. But I would argue that the program itself has to be at the secretary level, and you need an industry advisory committee that reports directly to the Secretary of Agriculture and Secretary of Commerce around the implementation of this plan. It has to include specific goals and timelines. It has to include assigned responsibilities. That is literally who in what agency does what, not this agency is going to do this. And it also needs to assign resources, and obviously that's going to involve Congress, right? You need resources in order to implement something like this. It has to have a regular assessment schedule. In other words, you need to examine how you're doing every 5 years or so, and that needs to include metrics. What are the metrics that we use to determine whether or not this program is being effective? Is it number of jobs? Is it number of companies? Is it acres? Is it pounds produced? And then it probably needs a scientific and an economic advisory board, so that the folks who are administering this plan, and particularly maybe the secretaries, can turn to those boards for advice on specific issues. So maybe an aquatic animal health issue, maybe a financing issue, what have you. That's the structure. These are the core components. It needs to include investment incentives. If we're going to prioritize aquaculture, as Caird read from the 1980 Aquaculture Act, we need to provide investment incentives to the financial community, just like we do to other sectors that we're prioritizing. We've provided investment incentives to high-tech manufacturing. We've provided investment incentives to a lot of different sectors within the economy. We need to do the same thing for aquaculture. It needs to have risk management programs. It needs to have programs that give investors confidence that if they take a risk and they fail, there's a chance for them to continue to survive and reinvest. It needs financing mechanisms which are specific to aquaculture. There are some unique challenges from a financing point of view for aquaculture operations, not the least of which, as I said earlier, the length of production time. It needs to include training programs, and I'll get back to training programs in a moment. And then, as I've alluded to earlier, it needs to include a national broodstock and hatchery program that provides for individual species at the early stages of that species development reasonably priced juveniles, and establishes a broodstock program that selects for performance and disease resistance within that species. That's something that a startup sector cannot afford to capitalize, and we've got great examples around the world where that kind of a program has really jump-started a particular species. So I believe that if we put forward a national development plan and we actually capitalized it and we gave people the tools they need to operationalize it, that we could by 2030 have this vision, if you will. We could have an industry, particularly in the marine environment, that has some security of tenure. We could have certainly more regulatory clarity and stability. I think we could have strong but non-duplicative regulations. Again, I want to say we need regulations, but we've got to figure out a way for them to not duplicate each other. Obviously, we'd have a plan, but I believe we'd also have a significant number of new startups. And we're going to have species and production method diversity because of the environments that we have in the United States. We have a very diverse set of environments. Why do I believe this? Because that's exactly what we did in Maine. 10 years ago, we came out with an economic development plan in Maine. And it had all the components that I outlined for you in that plan. And I credit that plan for the growth that we are going through right now in Maine. It was a collaborative project between the state and the private sector, but it was the private sector that drove it. It was us that organized it, financed it, organized the experts that we brought in to advise us, but the state was a full partner in it, and it resulted in surprisingly few regulatory changes but some very dramatic investments in programs that then have supported the development of the sector. Both that we are going through right now, if you look at the people who are starting businesses in Maine, who are starting new farms, roughly 60% of those people went through a training program in the last 10 years or so. And I think that's really tells a lot. Now that's training program for people who want to start businesses. It's not a training program for workers on farms, and there's a big difference between those two things. And what we are now doing is we've just done a workforce needs assessment in Maine, looking at the aquaculture sector, and we're now designing worker training programs as a supplement to our entrepreneurial training programs, because we need more workers. We need workers who know what they're doing and who aren't going to make the mistakes that we made as farmers when we started. You know, they say you have to kill 1 million fish before you become or an oyster, or 1 million oysters before you become a successful farmer. I would prefer to have that learning curve be a little shorter than the 1 million mark. I think that would be helpful. So I'm going to stop there and just say this. 50 years ago, we put a man on the moon. We did that with a 25-year development cycle. If we can put a man on the moon, we can damn well grow this sector in the United States of America, and we ought to do it. Thank you.
My name is Jamie Anderson from Lone Oak, Arkansas. We're bait fish farmers, and my family has operated this bait fish farm since 1949. That's 70 years. My granddad, once he got out of the military and started raising or catching wild bait fish in Yazoo City, Mississippi, and distributing them from there all the way over here to Lone Oak, Arkansas. And the neighbor across the road from our headquarters today was actually catching wild shiners out of Biomeda. He liked the hardiness and the temperament of the wild shiner from Biomeda better than the ones from the Yazoo River. So he just bought the 800 acres directly across the highway from the gentleman and started tearing down trees and building ponds and stocking those ponds with the wild bait fish that he caught out of Biomeda. And that was 1949. He was really the first one anybody knows of to domestically raise bait fish. Before that, all over the country, wild caught, and still a lot of it is today.
My name's Jennifer, and this is my brother William. We are third generation aquaculture farmers in Devils Bluff, Arkansas.
My grandfather's brother had been in the Pacific Theater of World War II, and he came back from the war, and my grandfather met him at the bus station down here in Devils Bluff, and he said, "Bob, I know where there's some nets and they're already tarred if you've got the money." And Bob had a pocket full of war money, and they went and bought commercial fishing nets, and they put them out on the river that weekend, and they caught enough fish out of the river that weekend to pay for the nets. And basically that was the beginnings of our family being in the aquaculture industry.
We do have our second, third, and fourth generation right now that are working on the farm, and we are selling to our second, third, and fourth generation customers.
The bait fish industry's been around since the late 1940s. It comprises about 30,000 acres. We produce literally 6 billion fish, and they're shipped all over the country.
And a lot of people, even in the state of Arkansas, don't realize how important Lone Oak County is to aquaculture nationwide. It's the hub for game fish, shiners, goldfish, hybrid striped bass, triploid grass carp. You know, Lone Oak County's #1 in all that.
We have a bait fish certification program in Arkansas that's really important because it guarantees that our fish are disease-free from what they call foreign animal diseases, and also are certified free of certain aquatic nuisance species. So it's a twofold process. This certification program is unique and the first of its kind in our country. We've been doing it for about 20 years, and we are really the only industry that does this. It's completely voluntary, but it's very strict and very rigid. The reason why we do these two things is to guarantee a product and give a level of assuredness to game and fish commissions and state regulatory agencies that the products that we're shipping into their states are completely safe.
The aquaculture industry is ready to thrive in the U.S., but up to 95% of the seafood we eat comes from out of the country, and very little inspections, very little control. There are people that are trying to do that all over the country, but the regulations put them out of business every time.
It is a family farm, and we did grow up here. We did work here. We helped build all of these ponds after my grandfather and my dad started working that. We did that together as siblings, and this is a very important heritage for us. We love how we grew up. We learned how to work hard, but we also learned how to love hard.
Those videos, it does touch on many sectors of family life in rural America and agriculture. I want to thank everyone for coming today, and especially our speakers and our sponsors, the NAA, Paul, thank you, the Catfish Farmers of America, National Aquaculture Association, and also the US Aquaculture Society. I want to open it up for questions to any of the speakers here, or any thoughts, comments. Feel free. We're pretty flexible. Garrett, get something to say. Come on. Even if it's making fun of my accent. Yes.
Hi, I'm Michael Rubino. Thanks to Sebastian for a shout out. Just wanted to follow up on CARED. Rex Rhodes gave a great presentation on what the Science Task Force of the federal agencies are doing under the Subcommittee on Aquaculture in terms of a report. As Sebastian said, we're preparing a companion regulatory task force report as well. The outline of that report is currently out for public comment, so I would urge you to take a look at that and make sure that we're addressing your needs and the things that you think are important. Karen and I are both hoping to get the drafts of those reports back to the full subcommittee in terms of federal review, and then out for public comment sometime later this calendar year, so that they'll be out there for public comment, at least by Aquaculture America, so we can talk about them then. I don't think they'll quite be finished by Aquaculture America, but we're aiming for springtime next year to get all the public comments back and to have those reports out. So the Regulatory Task Force report covers many of the topics that Sebastian covered. Jenny Malloy and Jen Manizak are here from EPA and FDA. They're part of that task force, as is Department of Interior. So I would urge you to take a look at that, and we welcome your comments on it. Thanks.
Michael, where should people look for that?
Good question. Do we know where to look for that? The Subcommittee on Aquaculture website is one place, and the NOAA Aquaculture website would be another one in terms of links to it.
And if you want, you can send us, USAS, we can put a link to it on our website also.
Great, happy to do that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. I think it's an exciting time to be in aquaculture. Like I said, I think it from a big picture, not a specific species, or having worked all over the East Coast and throughout the US and the World Aquaculture Society, it's been a very rewarding experience to see so many farmers getting through those hurdles to make their livelihoods stay and remain viable through all the regulatory and all the environmental issues and temperature changes. And I just really, one of my goals as president of USAS was to help change the perception of aquaculture throughout the US. And I want people to realize that even those beautiful set of pearls that most fathers give their daughters at graduation, thank an aquaculturist, because those cultured pearls started out on the fish farm. People don't always think of how it infiltrates all our lives, but even that little prize trout that your granddaughter caught out of first fishing day was probably started out in a hatchery and stocked out of, Paul, what was it, 1.5 billion fish stocked annually into our pay lakes, ponds, and federal waters for recreational. So it's out there, we're out there. USAS thanks all of you for attending and presenting and being part of this. We are a resource for you guys to use, and if we don't know the answer, we'll try and find it, or we'll make something up and then see who will benefit by it now. We are a resource for you guys to use, and it's really, really helpful in the last 30 years I've been working here that the agencies on the federal level are coming together to support this industry. So if there's no, yes?
Thanks, Angela. So I'm Bill Dewey with Taylor Shellfish Farms out in Washington State, and I just wanted to echo your sentiments about it being an exciting time for aquaculture. here in the United States. So I've been at this almost as long as you and Sebastian, maybe not quite. And involved in the public policy arena for a lot of years. And I've been here on the Hill this week with the National Aquaculture Association. They had their board of directors meeting here on Monday, and then we did Hill visits yesterday. And then at the hearing this morning. And it's just really rewarding to see the national dialogue that's happening around trying to grow domestic aquaculture. I've been in meetings with the administration, and we've certainly heard from our NOAA and commerce partners here. There's a lot of buzz. And when you go into these offices, these young staffers and Hill offices, they know what aquaculture is, they're informed, they've got good questions, and so all of these collective efforts, including this forum that you guys have put on, thank you for doing that. We're raising knowledge, raising awareness, and raising excitement, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes in the years to come.
Thank you, Bill. When I chose aquaculture as my area of study at the University of Rhode Island, it was very, very new, and it was taught by a chicken producer. And I went home and I was all excited, and my mom said, aquaculture, what's that, underwater ballet? So it's come a long way to be in the #1 food production system worldwide today, and I'm really happy to be part of that. So, yes, sir.
Jeff Silverstein with USDA. I wanted to thank USAS, Catfish Farmers, and National Aquaculture Association for making this opportunity. And it's exciting to see the collaboration and working together. And I think you're stepping up your game, and the federal government will also respond and step up. The subcommittee on aquaculture has really elevated and focused. The result is these 2 task force on science and regulations, and really look forward to working with the industry and moving forward.
Good, thank you, Jeff.